A ver, igual estoy acá, no ahora boludo, nada. O sea, estoy acá, pero no podéis ver esto porque esto es una sorpresa. Esa plastic penis, sí, compramos un dildo de dragón.
Mira.
A ver,
A ver, pásame el cuchillo.
sí.
Bueno, póntelo. Y ahorita vemos cómo lo acomodas.
Listo. Pensé que mi cabeza no era tan grande.
No,
A ver.
pero a ver. Es un desastre.
¿Por qué? Ah, ¿se puede poner de esa manera? A ver. Está muy cortito.
Demasiado, ¿verdad?
Sí. Hola, hola. Valen Play, ¿qué tal?
Bueno, ya será cosa de que tú
Yo
lo
lo acomodo, sí.
revises y lo acomodes cuando te veas la jeta en el espejo.
Pero sí, funciona. Yo lo usaría así, como usaba el otro. Todo suelto ahí. Perfecto. Pero queda el coso ahí flotando, ¿no?
Es como Back to the Future.
Soy... Ah, a ver este.
Sí, son parecidos en realidad. Espérame, que tienen un plástico.
Soy The Man Anxiety. A ver. A ver qué tal.
Baratuli.
Baratuli.
Todo tuyo,
¿Todo
sí.
cool? ¿El
Sí.
mundo del futuro volvió?
Te puedes ver en el espejo si quieres.
No, confío. Ahora cuando venga Farfa le muestro. Hacemos el cosplay. Ahí está. Perfecto. Y ahora el coso. A ver si me cagaron.
Eso sí lo puedes ver.
Sí, eso sí lo voy a mostrar. Bueno, ya está. Ya probé el cosplay de Omega. Existe. Cosplay Omega existe, ya llegó. Y ahora esto que solamente es un regalo para mí. Y para el stream, pero para mí no. Yo, a ver cómo va. Oh, ahí sale, sale. Oh. Tum. Ah, ahí está. Jeje.
¿Te quedó tu cabezota?
Sí. No sé cómo se usa eso, pero ahí está. Queda bien. Ahí está. Ahí está. Hola Oka, me acaba de llegar este gorro. No me voy a sacar más. Amor,
Se te van a hacer piojos, amiga.
¿qué onda esto? ¿Cómo se usa?
Ah, es que eso se atora arriba.
A ver.
Va, eso creo.
Lo voy a atar. O me da gorro. Lo voy a atar hasta saber qué hacer con él.
Sí, supongo que sí va.
Ahí está. Listo.
Ah, bueno.
Voy a tener que comprar esos auriculares pequeños.
Comprar, sí. Comprar.
¡Qué asco!
No sé, Omega, no tenemos dinero y quieres comprar 10.000 cosas.
Ahora vas a ver. Ahora se viene. ¿Qué es esto? Bueno, no entra, pero ahí está.
Es que tienes una cabezota.
No, tengo que... usar los auriculares de mierda pequeños porque ya sabía que no iba a entrar con este gorro. El gorro, amor, ¿viste el gorro? Mira, agárralo. Mira cómo es. Es un coso. Ah, te queda muy bonito. ¿Cómo entra? ¿Entra bien?
Sí, a mí me queda bien, creo que me queda grande.
Esto en el fondo, la santería es lava. Joder, jugar metro ahí. Está tu cool. Está tu cool.
Vamos a comer. ¿O comes aquí?
No, como aquí esta vez. Así termino de ver esto.
Es que no sé si la comida te va a gustar, por eso digo.
No, está bien.
Pero vamos a que veas la comida y ya.
Está bien. No voy con esto puesto porque me van a pegar.
Bueno.
Ahí. Salgo afuera con esto. ¡Hola, familia del perro! Todo cool. Ahora vuelvo.
Eres el perrito del
Dale
medio,
omega un
¿verdad?
poco más rojo para la otra.
Un poco de rojo para la otra. Lo detonan. Omega descuido. Ahora vuelvo. Vuelvo en nada.
Ya encontré una forma de que te quede mejor. A ver, lo doblé un poquito, o sea, menos que antes. Pero es que
A ver.
el tamaño de tu cabeza es extraño.
¿Qué tal?
Ajá, creo que así está mejor. O sea, se ve un poco menos raro. Las cosas.
¡Ah! Parezco un pendeviejo.
Y ahora sí.
Vamos a ver la comida. Te la cosa prendida.
Oh no.
Eh,
Me hace mucho calor.
Aprovecho. Ahí está. Boom. Gracias. Hola. Uy, ya volví. Ah. Calidad. Sí, calidad. Linda gorra. O sea, tan nice. Habían gorras de 1 millón incomprables, pero esta está a un buen precio. Y está bien, para mantener la ilusión, está lindo y es gigante. Para mi cabeza. O sea, me queda un poco justa, pero no molesta. Así que está bien. No voy a mentir, está justita, pero está nice. Y si quisiera que me tape más, pum, lo bajo.
Es que tienes una cabezota.
Sí, imposible comprarme algo coherente. Porque tengo una cabeza masiva, es mi culpa. Nací extraño. Hay una cosa, bueno, no sé. Cariño, ¿alguna vez me tocaste la nuca?
No.
Bueno, después tocámela.
A ver.
Mira.
A ver.
Mira.
A ver. ¿Qué tienes?
Mira esto.
¿Dónde?
Ahí.
¿Y eso?
Es un hueso.
¿En serio?
Sí.
¿Y eso?
Es una forma, no sé, lo tengo puntiagudo ahí.
Qué raro.
Sí. Estoy de forma, vos.
Un poco sí.
Pero ahí está. Pum, purum, pururururururum, pum, purum, pururururururum, pum, purum, pururururururu, rurururururururun, pururururururururun. Bueno, cuando se pueda mostramos la otra sorpresita, pero esta era la cosa que quería. Y ya está. Invertí en esto. Y después tengo que devolver la penny porque me van a pegar. Me va a destruir el as. Bueno. Uy. Vamos a seguir viendo el video. Y voy a comer, ¿sí? Mientras vemos. ¿Está bien? ¿Les gusta? ¿Les agrada la idea? Yo que se te quiere mucho. Bueno, voy a proceder a comer.
Actually are and how little of an impact, how obscure these expansion packs actually are and how little of an impact they actually made. Being included in
Ah, miren. Es una sopa con esto. ¿Cómo se llamaba esta verdura? Brócoli. Miren, un brócoli gigante. Y son varios. Es una verdura, es una sopa de brócoli. Mukbang. Wow.
in the modern remasters is likely bringing them to a much wider audience than ever played them in the first 2 decades of their existence. Forgotten artifacts of the old days of gaming. So much of the abandoned content developed for Quake before it was finalized made it into Dissolution of Eternity, not just the dragon. Like all these antiquity-themed levels, before moving backwards in time, you need to pass 4 elemental challenges, which is kind of interesting to convey with such limited 3D tools. So the air challenge becomes moving through accelerator pipes like some kind of Mario level after the Silent Hill air raid siren rings. The fire levels challenge lies mostly in confronting tiny versions of Cthon. Compromises, then, with what's already possible within the engine, instead of creating expensive new set pieces. Once you pass the elemental trials, your time traveling begins in earnest. First, ancient Greece, identifiable mostly from the pixel tile mosaics and the big pillars. It is still Quake. But after so very, very many levels based on the same templates and textures, it is very exciting to get a new kind of look for the game. It's incongruous, awkward, and strange, but that is exactly the appeal at this stage of Quake. Quake 1's appeal lies so much more in the messy confusion of it than its technical successes. It was a pioneering prototype, but it was such an odd prototype that much of what the game actually is never carried forward into newer titles. Take the next level, Egyptian-themed. It looks completely unique from pretty much every other Quake level, but at its heart, it's still an overcomplicated maze of corridors. It's also one of the longest levels in the entire game, taking almost half an hour. sometimes one of the darkest and blandest levels too. Hey, how about that Sphinx though? The game pivots oddly to an Aztec theme next. That's the least of the levels, and the one that got me asking, is this a story of some sort, this moving backwards in time, or is it more of just an organizing theme? With the absolute minimal amount of narrative investment, is there a difference between theme and story? For whom does the story exist? Is it for the player to understand the context of their play? Or is it for whom does the story exist? Is it for the...
Amor, Quake 1 tiene un nivel donde podés viajar a dimensiones y una de las dimensiones es azteca. Y estoy viendo al chabón masacrar a un guerrero azteca.
Fuck.
No se va aleatorio.
With the absolute minimal amount of narrative investment, is there a difference between theme and story? For whom does the story exist? Is it for the player to understand the context of their play? Or is it for the level designer to create a structure for coming up with ideas for levels? If all the game is boils down to labyrinths and bloodshed, and that's why the player is there, then doesn't the story at that point become just a method of organization and little else? In the early years of gaming, this was often the mindset, that story didn't matter much compared to the vibes and the verbs of the game mechanics. Quake's historical irony is that the transition to 3D game worlds was how narrative became such an important pillar of game design in general. As games evolved from abstracted experiences into more directly representational ones, as the distance between how the real world looks and how these digital world looks continued to shrink, cinematic design came to almost completely replace the labyrinthine style. Quake's technology allowed this transition to happen, and so the game itself feels oddly backwards this way, rejecting the narrative-driven future that games like Strife had already been pushing towards. At the end of Dissolution of Eternity, you fight your dragon at the beginning of time, destroying the machine that was disrupting the regular flow of events. Everything goes back to normal. It was as if it was all a dream, or all a nightmare, a vague journey of mood and sensation through a place that makes no logical sense, that has no permanence upon awakening. Quake 2 agrees with this assessment of Quake 1 as essentially a dream. It takes the entire concept and starts over, taking it from the top, focusing on narrative more than any other
Voy a comer la segunda comida. La primera era una sopa de brócoli y esto tengo tortilla, no tortilla, no sé cómo se llama esto, pero esto me lo dice, siempre me lo dice, lo olvidé. Y una ensalada con carne, el cual es fantástico. Creo haberlo comido antes, así que cool. Bueno, seguimos escuchando y bueno, mientras devoro la cosa. Mukbang, sí. Ahí está. Tengo que ordenar eso. Una marinera. No, creo que no. Pero bueno. Después les comento cuando termine de comer.
Agrees with this assessment of Quake 1 as essentially a dream. It takes the entire concept and starts over, taking it from the top, focusing on narrative more than any other id shooter had at that point in time. Quake 2 doesn't just have any old story, it was developed as a very loose sci-fi adaptation of the 1961 World War II movie The Guns of Navarone, which isn't speculation, the developers have explicitly said as much. In Guns of Navarone, a group of commandos assault an isolated island where German anti-air emplacements are making it impossible to launch a rescue for the island's many prisoners of war. The guns need to come down, and the commandos have to put it all on the line and make a considerable sacrifice to do it. If there's any consistent criticism of Guns of Navarone as a film, it's that it's formulaic, even for 1961. That formula is exactly why it could be adapted into a 3D video game about fighting biomechanical space monsters almost 40 years later. All the character work in the movie is tossed out. Quake 2 has no characters for the most part besides a handful of names. The setting from the movie gets tossed. The majority of the actual scenes of the movie go by unreferenced in any way. So in what way...
Uy. Debí preguntar antes de comer, porque es mi culpa. Lo cual está bien. Como... Oh, bueno, sigamos viendo.
Scenes of the movie go by unreferenced in any way. So in what way is Quake 2 adapted?
Tenía cilantro, no, está hasta arriba de... Digo, tenía leche, no, está hasta arriba de cilantro. Perdón.
Unreferenced in any way. So in what way is Quake 2 adapted from guns when the movie gets tossed? The majority of the actual scene part later. All the character work in the movie is tossed out. Quake 2 has no characters for the most part besides a handful of names. The setting from the movie gets tossed. The majority of the actual scene...
Es perejil. A ver. No me sabe perejil.
Scenes of the movie go by unreferenced in any way. So in what way is Quake 2 adapted from Guns of Navarone? The vibes, man. Just as Quake 1 was primarily a mood piece, designed according to emotional suggestion, Quake 2 works on the same principles. But instead of the disorganized chaos of the first game's production, the mood is channeled and molded to be imitative of an action thriller from the early 1960s. Characters, scenes, and setting are not necessary when all Quake 2 wants to steal from Guns of Navarone is the emotional tone. So the story of Quake is completely rewritten and retconned in the manual, which I remember reading with interest in the passenger seat of my dad's Toyota Camry when I was like 12. This is where childhood me picked up the game, although it was far too confusing in the level design for me to finish until I was in my teens. The manual exposits, quote, "Long shadows claw desperately away from your dusty combat boots, fueled by the relentless sun of a late Texas afternoon. Shading your eyes against the glare, you squint for the thousandth time at the line of soldiers ahead of you. It stretches on endlessly across the rubble, disappearing at last into the cool shadows of a troop carrier. Soon, you'll walk up the ramp into the ship, climb into your one-man cocoon, tear through the interplanetary gateway, and smash down, light years away from the blowing sand and blasted ruins that surround the Dallas Metro crater. Slightly rocking back and forth under the sweltering August sun, you spit out of the side of your mouth, rub your eyes, and think back to the day when the wretched creatures first attacked. Like flaming meteors, their crafts pounded into the earth, and unbelievably, these biomechanical aliens, these hideous cyborgs, swarmed out while their ships still sizzled with re-entry heat. They killed or captured anything that lived. We figured the Strogg were after our planet's resources, minerals, metal, and water, things like that. But their onboard storage facilities did little to disguise what they considered to be resources. Fleshy limbs and organs for new cyborgs, and of course, food. You recall your first official day of training, your unit commander discussing how these damn... They killed... pounded into the day when the wretched creatures first attacked. Like flaming meteors, their crafts pounded into the earth, and unbelievably, these biomechanical aliens, these hideous cyborgs, swarmed out while their ships still sizzled with re-entry heat. They killed or captured anything that lived. We figured the Strogg were after our planet's resources, minerals, metal, and water, things like that. But their onboard storage facilities did little to disguise what they considered to be resources. Fleshy limbs and organs for new cyborgs, and of course, food. You recall your first official day of training, your unit commander discussing how these damn parasites made it to the Earth and other nearby colonies in the first place. By employing our best satellites and long-range scanners, we learned...
¿Qué estás morfando, Alquito? Ya estamos, ya lo vi. No sé cómo se llama. Creo que Penny me dijo cómo se llama, pero lo olvidé.
Learned how they travel light years so quickly. The Strogg use these black hole-like gateways scanners, we learned how they travel light years so quickly. The Strogg use these black hole-like gateways as their highway to heaven. We still don't know if they created these rips in the fabric of space and time, or if they simply discovered them by accident. Either way, it's like opening the door to an all-you-can-eat restaurant for these bastards. In about 2 hours, we'll be entering the same interstellar portals to hit them where it hurts, on their own turf. End quote. So from Guns of Navarone, we steal the framing device of world power versus world power, playing for the stakes of global survival, but seen from the perspective of a single Marine within that conflict. From Quake 1, we steal the teleporter technology, the general idea that there was some kind of previous conflict, and now we're doing a sequel that turns it around. Like Guns of Navarone, it's an underdog story where the villains are clear and unrepentant, focusing on bringing down a giant piece of artillery that keeps the conflict necessarily limited in scope until that artillery can be destroyed. To make room for the new Space Marine stuff, all the old Space Marine stuff from Quake 1 had to be completely overwritten. No mention of Quake, that fast-moving bastard, whatsoever. Which is fine, because you left off the last game altering the flow of time at its root. Because the last expansion pack went so nuts with its plot, that plot, astoundingly, does not conflict with a top-to-bottom retcon of every single element of setting and storytelling. Which I think is just so fucking funny. And more, it's illustrative of how weird of a franchise Quake is and how wildly it varies from title to title. Anything goes, broadly speaking, anyway. The funny thing about Quake 2 is that once you get past the novelty of the framing and the confidently complete reworking of the basic concept, this game is the most fundamentally straightforward out of all of the Quakes. One of the most illuminating anecdotes about Quake 2's production, I think, is that as reported by game history website Hardcore Gaming 101, musician Trent Reznor declined to do the soundtrack for the second game like he did for the first, because he thought Quake 2 had no atmosphere. Reznor's soundtrack for the first game is a massive element of the original success in building a consistent, immersive mood. Quake 1's music does not sound like what one might expect. It's not loud, it's not fast-moving. In an interview from back in 2000, Reznor himself explains it like this for Insight magazine. Quote, "With the music of Quake, there was this approach. It's dark, depressing, dingy, kill everything, tense. Okay, what films have that same sense of dread? The decision on my part was not to make it amped up, so I kept everything subtle, so you wouldn't get sick of it the second time you play the game, but I would set up elements of tension. And because it was off the CD, it could be as many instruments as I wanted. It could be an orchestra, it could be one thing. That was a huge relief. Though they were always siding on the side of gameplay over, say, having the shotgun sound in stereo. But then, they should be. The game is about playing."
Estamos viendo un análisis de los Quakes y eso.
Say, having the shotgun sound in stereo. But then, they should be. The game is about playing the game. I remember when the game came out, I saw it at the Virgin Megastore, and on the box it said, "New Nine Inch Nails music," but I always thought that was an inappropriate way to look at it. For what it was, it's good, but it's not meant to be listened to on its own. What I was hoping to achieve with it was not so much some adrenaline-pumping, let's go.
Si alguno lo quiere, les dejo el código de Fallout 2 acá, no es ningún virus ni nada. Bueno, gracias. ¿Alguien lo agarra?
Appropriate way to look at it. For what it was,
El código de GOG, no de Steam. Ah.
It's good. But it's not meant.
Es una skin o algo así, no un jueguito. ¿Eh?
I always thought that was an inappropriate way to look at it. For what it was, it's good, but it's not meant to be listened to on its own. What I was hoping to achieve with it was not so much some adrenaline-pumping, let's go kick-ass Rob Zombie kind of music, but more like the music in films by John Carpenter, the tension and uneasiness, or David Lynch, the dissonance or sound as atmosphere enhancement. End quote. Quake 2, in contrast, uses exactly that kind of music which creates an adrenaline-pumping, Rob Zombie-esque, let's go kick-ass atmosphere. One-man German rock sensation Sonic Mayhem did the soundtrack for Quake 2 instead of Trent Reznor. Sonic Mayhem even helped out on the soundtracks for the expansion packs, which is cool because the Quake 1 expansions did not carry over Reznor's sound or sound style at all, and came out kind of generic. Sonic Mayhem's work on Quake 2, and also on Quake 3, isn't generic at all. It's perfectly paired with the player experience, a creative precursor to the way Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal used heavy metal soundscapes to support and channel the frenzy of gameplay. Quake 2's soundtrack is equally good as Quake 1's, as is the gameplay, but differently competent. Quake 2 experiments only so much as it contributes to the core gameplay loop. Quake 1's successes were as accidental as they were intentional. Quake 2's successes are all coordinated and planned, refinements on the messy first draft that the original Quake laid down. I really disagree with the idea that Quake 2 has no atmosphere. The atmosphere is just ultimately more familiar to modern players, the tense and dreary oppression of wartime violence that modern visual media has been iterating on since the Guns of Navarone and long before. Quake 1 was exciting for Reznor because it was novel, it was experimental. He got to make strange music to accompany strange art. Little about Quake 2 is actually strange, but like the new Sonic Mayhem soundtrack, what it lacks in novelty, it makes up for in verve and intensity. It's wild how much closer Quake 2 feels to modern rhythms of play than Doom 1 and 2 or Wolfenstein 3D did by a huge margin. And maybe this was the idea in remastering instead of remaking the early Quakes. On release, Quake 2 was a transitional title. Its linear campaign was a step forward, but not enough of one to feel like a shift in the whole FPS subgenre. Quake 2 came out on November 11th, 1997. On November 19th, 1998, a game using a heavily modified Quake 2 engine came out called Half-Life. The ways in which Half-Life revolutionized the presentation and pacing of first-person shooters are almost too many to count. Half-Life created so many of the moments and motifs that still define cinematic, naturalistic presentation in hundreds of titles. Half-Life's primary pacing device is arranging its interconnected levels in an unbroken chain, creating a sense of linear progression and a cumulative journey. Quake 2 was designed with something similar but not quite as naturalistic. Quake 2 divides itself instead into units of levels, which are arranged in a linear order, but it breaks them up with short videos showing you moving between the unit areas. It's kind of like how Doom 1's levels were shown on a little world map as you moved between them. It seems like such a small difference for Quake 2 to have these transitions and for Half-Life not to, but Half-Life's deeper creative choice is that it never uses pre-rendered cutscenes at all for anything. It begins in-engine, with the player in first-person control, and remains that way throughout the entire climax and even the brief epilogue conversation with the mysterious G-Man. By allowing you to play the game, immersive soundscapes and level design also encourage a player to forget that they are playing. It creates an experience that always exists within the player's present tense. Quake 2's more deliberate structure, the factory unit, palace unit, the prison unit, and all the cutscenes tying them together, remind a player they are playing a video game, and should probably treat it as such. Players are given a tally of secrets found and enemies killed for a level of a unit on completion of that unit. It reaches towards a kind of narrative immersion with the way the units fit together and paint a cumulative portrait of the Strogg and their homeworld of Strogos. Quake 2's individual pieces are made with visible seams, however, where Half-Life's are invisible beyond the minimalist loading text. At these visible seams and unit transitions, you are treated as the player and graded as a player, not a player character. Quake 2's narrative elements are too slight and its gestures towards immersion too antiquated to feel like a modern campaign the way its gameplay still actually feels in meaningful conversation with modern FPS conventions. So if you remade it, all shiny and new, something would feel off about it. It would feel just as stuck between eras as it was on release. By remastering it, instead, these points of friction also become points of historical interest. Keeping the original aesthetic preserves the original creative intentions. It preserves that sense of playing some kind of forward-thinking but odd or awkward prototype, like going to a car museum and seeing the old steam-driven buggies whose engines would have to come up to temperature before even being used. The fascination is not in comparing with the modern day, but in appreciating how it was done then. The imagination and technical creativity involved in creating an industry that had never existed in the world before. Quake 1's chaotic development is reflected in a lack of cohesion in the campaign. Quake 2, on the other hand, represents a much more deliberate and businesslike refinement of all the production methods that had been learned on Quake 1. It was not the era that came before, where 3D was new and completely undefined, and it was not the era that came after, where 3D game space was interpreted as a stage onto which more conventional cinematic and theatrical narrative could be projected. Quake 2 has always been somewhere in between, stuck in a period of industry transition that leaves it a bit of a creative orphan. A remake would have no power to resolve that transition and would hurt its own presentation in the process. A remaster, though, a good remaster like this, celebrates that period of transition and illuminates it, placing the art in the context where its imaginative leaps can actually be appreciated. The opening cinematic sets a perfect mood for what's to come. The human warships, green and menacing, pulling into orbit around an angry red planet, your personal pod released as part of the grand invasion, just like it said it would in the manual. So the manual story isn't just stapled on, much of it is exactly as visually portrayed here in the opening cutscene, creating a greater sense of immediate narrative than Quake 1 had. Then your pod crashes, and off you go, blaster in hand. In terms of 3D level design, this is exactly the opening as well. Here is your smoking, broken pod behind you, and the whole of Strogos ahead of you. Quake 1, like Half-Life, allowed player interactivity from the very beginning, even for things like difficulty selection and world selection, but by integrating these abstract menu choices into the interactivity, Quake 1 never created a feeling of natural immersion like Half-Life did. Creating these narrative bookends with cutscenes and player statistics allowed Quake 2 to attempt to portray a more linear cinematic journey for the player without sacrificing the self-awareness as a shooter that was part of the personality of id Games. That self-awareness is even a major part of the studio's personality today, with the ironic meta-mythology of Doom Eternal. That's what sets those games apart these days, though. Game design as a whole followed Half-Life's example so much more than it did Quake 1 or Quake 2. Quake itself, as a franchise, is as convoluted as it is because it contorted so strangely trying to chase some of those trends with Quake 3 and Quake 4 and Quake Champions. Quake 2 is an anchor of sorts for the franchise. It makes the most sense and plays the best out of all of them, at least from my perspective, as someone who prefers campaigns to multiplayer. From this crash site on the edge of the capital city, you need
Hola, oh my god. Hola, churro.
to fight your way campaigns to multiplayer. From this crash site on the edge of the capital city, you need to fight your way closer and closer to the core, taking down the Navarone-influenced artillery piece, disabling the city's defenses, and eventually storming the palace to take down the ancient emperor of the whole Strogg Empire. Narratively, the Strogg are actually very fascinating because they're kind of a speculative endpoint of what any society that exists solely for the sake of conflict will look like. Industrial abuse and endless wars left Strogos what it is now, a desolate wasteland of heavy industry, populated only by slaves. The Strogg use cybernetics to take all the useful pieces of their enemies and reanimate them for the war machine's purposes. It's an infinite suffering from which death is no escape, the flesh and the machine, in a foul symbiosis where neither half lets the other half wither or die. Because the Strogg can only conquer and process, not grow or create, they use the Slipgate technology to take the fight to other worlds. But they done did mess with Texas, didn't they? And after the crushing defeat they suffered in Dallas, it's time for humanity to reverse the tables and take the invasion to the Strogg directly. As a hive mind, taking out the Macron, their general, should end the war. Considering how much time I spent trying to figure out what was even going on in Quake 1, this narrative clarity of Quake 2 is very refreshing. The plot, minimal as it is, works very well as a horror concept. It's using sci-fi to present an enemy that's both visually disturbing and thematically disturbing, even thematically satirical in some ways. In terms of immersion and how the game fuses horror elements with environmental storytelling, the research labs and prisons are the most fascinating levels of Quake 2. All throughout the game are these moments where giant machines are being used to mutilate and pulp human prisoners of war, turned into slurry, biomass, fuel for the war machine. While Quake 2 has given up almost entirely on fantasy tropes or imagery in favor of sci-fi, these massive industrial torture devices are visceral and sadistic in a very obviously Spanish Inquisition kind of way. These torture rooms tie Quake 1 to Quake 2 aesthetically, in addition to creating some of the strongest imagery in the game. They toe the line between cartoonish absurdism and genuine, horror-driven despair, sad, and also silly, and also preposterously gory for the time. This has been part of the tone of id shooters ever since the original Doom, a huge part of the vibe in Quake 1. Just because Quake 2 is very brown in places doesn't mean that it isn't part of that tradition of
Ahora, una cosa, pausa. Porque el chabón está haciendo lo mismo que yo. Toca un botón y se para a ver qué pasa. Y es muy bueno.
the tone of id shooters ever since the original Doom, a huge part of the vibe in Quake 1. Just because Quake 2 is very brown in places doesn't mean that it isn't part of that tradition of creative sadism or doesn't have that same kind of tone. It's just a little more hidden beneath the more surface elements of earth tone military sci-fi. Quake 2's focus on military sci-fi is ultimately what defines the pacing of the game, though, more than any aesthetic flourish. Quake 1's levels were so individual from each other, with minor exceptions like the elemental trials in the expansion, so that the succession of one maze after another became, eventually, exhausting. Each unit of Quake 2 is so tightly oriented around its end goal, instead, that this fatigue never sets in. And a unit of levels, all three the elemental aesthetic flourish. Quake 1's levels were so individual from each other, with minor exceptions like the elemental trials in the expansion, so that the succession of one maze after another became, eventually, exhausting. Each unit of Quake 2 is so tightly oriented around its end goal, instead, that this fatigue never sets in. In a unit of levels, all three levels will tie into each other. There will be parts of a level that you return to and pass through differently. Backtracking heavily would be annoying, but the level design rarely requires this. It loops back around on itself in ways that always feel so clever and surprising. This is all driven by complications in the military goals. You can't blow up the thingamajig while the who's-a-whatsits is still active. You've got to go down into the service oubliette and readjust the widget valve so the power cube can power up. All these little complications bounce a player from one map to another, and they also build anticipation so that achieving the unit goal feels like something that actually has a little drama and a little heft to it. These goals get more interesting the deeper into the game a player gets. By the time you get to the factory unit, every unit goal is about destroying key pieces of Strogg war infrastructure. The power plant unit is a particularly interesting example of the contrast between Quake 2 and Half-Life because both games have this set piece where you have to navigate a gigantic power plant. In the climax of Half-Life, you're powering up the portal to Zen, the alternate dimension, and everything is done up in these bright whites and oranges. It looks like a big machine. Quake 2 has you shutting down a gigantic reactor plant instead, but it chooses not to mix up the aesthetic in any major way. It's still mostly rusty corridors and rusty machinery. Half-Life even ultimately requires more platforming from a player than Quake 2 does. Yet despite the platforming, Half-Life feels less artificial than Quake 2 because of its more careful visual design and its more deliberately immersive setting. Quake 2 reaches its peak of design, I feel, towards the end. The Palace of the Macron is such a cool departure from what had come before, a little pomp, a little decoration. It's interesting to me because of its suggestion that the Strogg have some sense of culture, but that it's faded and vestigial, like an echo of something they can no longer remember. The way Quake 2 ramps up its difficulty over time is very kind compared to Quake 1, and because of this, the last levels are the only parts of the game that are very difficult, the way Quake 1 so often was in Worlds 2 through 4. Giving the tank enemies an even more powerful Royal Guard version at the climax is a great idea too. From the encounter design to the level's aesthetics, everything feels appropriately climactic. It genuinely feels like treading on forbidden ground hunting for the hidden hand behind the Strogg. And finding him is even better. The Macron, instead of leaning into the horror of biomechanical fusion, is almost totally devoid of visible flesh. The Macron looks, in some ways, a little underwhelming. Those little robot guys that look like Wall-E with legs and a terrible disease, those are made in the Macron's image. I love this design because of how it emphasizes the Strogg's indifference to pain and suffering, that all humans are nothing but spare parts. If the Macron is primarily a robot or too far removed from the flesh to remember, then pain is, in fact, an alien concept to it, and it has no reason to feel any sympathy at all. It is an insurmountable gap in perspective, which is what often feels alien in science fiction villains. Your final fight with the Macron takes place on a secret base in the asteroid field around the planet. He flees the palace as you fight your way through and retreats through a portal to this final arena, which sets up itself such a memorable little ending. Post-battle, the station begins to deteriorate. You can go looking for secrets or just escape as the gravity goes sour. For the final cutscene, you hurtle back towards the planet's surface just like you had at the beginning, but this time you pop the door off the pod and your character's hand sticks out to give a quivering, triumphant. It is so simple, so self-consciously fun. Quake 2 is a game that refuses to overcomplicate itself, and in doing so, it is equally more coherent and satisfying than its predecessor. The first expansion pack for Quake 2, The Reckoning, was released by Xatrix Entertainment. This is notable for the kind of expansion that it turned out to be. The Reckoning takes the basic frame of the lone marine with a difficult mission and tries to add even more cinematic set-piece touches. It's very playful, if less consistent than the main campaign. The expansion's main interest is in creating a sense of long journey and constant escalation of environment. The manual story mostly just retells a marine pod landing gone wrong until the last few lines, which I enjoy very much. Not because it's good, but because it's cheesy and awful in the most ideal possible way. It reads, quote, "Something's out there. Mud coating and aching, you dropped into a crouch behind a mossy boulder and search for a weapon. Even a rock would be something. Hot damn, better than you could have hoped for. It's your shotgun, loaded and ready to rock and roll. Splash, splash, splash. You rack a shell in the chamber and jump up, aches and pains forgotten. Too many damn fine Marines didn't make ground fall today. The Strogg are gonna pay. You swear that soon, real soon, there'll be a reckoning." End quote. Hot damn, a shotgun, loaded to rock and roll. That's all a growing boy needs, really. It's this kind of pulp from which the modern Doom series is built, the basis of all the storytelling in Doom Eternal. So you can see why Quake fits in awkwardly with the modern id catalog. It's already been scavenged in so many ways and reinvented in so many others, all of which conflict with each other. Even if the fundamental impulse of all of these games boils concisely down to hot damn a shotgun. The new levels begin on the outskirts in bland canyon lands fighting weird beasts. This portion is the one that feels the cheapest. It's an understandable impulse to want to explore the outdoor setting a little more, but the visual effects are just bland and murky. All of this is a prelude anyway. The real meat of the mission pack is in the labyrinthine Strogg military installations ahead. The Reckoning has a tremendous understanding of everything that made Quake 2's levels feel cohesive, the surprise recursions and the colored lighting, the blood and the boxes. What it adds is a more
Hola Antonio, ¿qué tal?
surprise recursions and the colored lighting, the blood and the boxes. What it adds is a more sensical progression and a more grounded set of goals. A fascinating mid-expansion moment comes as you're reintroduced to the outdoor door canyon lands. You need to find an aerial strike beacon, but it's been stolen by the weird singing poison lizard men, so you need to track them back to their lair. When the airstrike comes through, it's a special effects bonanza that opens up a new path forward through the level. What's interesting about this is that Xatrix's journey to fame as a wargame studio sort of began here. Previously, they had published Siberia 1 and 2, an odd but lovable adventure
Qué guapo te ves, amiga, Dios. Hola, Lucas.
here. Previously, they had published Siberia 1 and 2, an odd but lovable adventure game on-rail shooter hybrid, and also two goofball shooters called Redneck Rampage. The Reckoning was a chance to do something a little more grounded, as strange as that sounds. Xatrix became Grey Matter Games, which developed the ahead-of-its-time expansion to the original Call of Duty, United Offensive. United Offensive was a considerable improvement over the main campaign in terms of cinematic immersion and level cohesion, just like they did for Quake 2. Later on, Grey Matter was absorbed into Treyarch and has worked on Call of Duty ever since. But
Ellos eran Grey Matter, eran Xatrix y después Treyarch. Yo sé que Grey Matter era Treyarch, pero no tenía información de que eran, que habían hecho la expansión de Quake. Qué grosos.
Grey Matter was absorbed.
Un análisis sobre Quake, esto que es, estudio de basura, sobre Quake, la franquicia en general.
Into Treyarch and has worked on Call of Duty ever since. But the studio's very first attempt at a military first-person shooter started all the way back here with The Reckoning. Here's how ambitious the level design is. On the unit transition map, the climax looks to be Unit 4, the spaceport, but it isn't. The spaceport is a huge, sprawling thing where your objective ultimately comes down to stowing away inside of a crate to be loaded onto a freighter. Then you spend a very difficult level shooting your way up to the bridge of the freighter with a boss fight of sorts against the bridge crew. Once hijacked, you land the freighter on the moon and infiltrate the moon base, which looks suitably more high-tech and fancy than any of the regular level textures. Once other games began to explore the possibilities of a 3D game space, not just Half-Life, but also titles like the original Jedi Knight, these sorts of visually dramatic, narratively grounded level progressions became the norm. Even within the campaigns of Quake 2's original release, there was so much room for improvement. Xatrix improved on these ideas immediately, seizing on that faint phantom thread of the Guns of Navarone influence and iterating on ideas that would have the studio, later, be something of an authority on World War II game design. It's a step towards that more modern era, similar to how Scourge of Armagon refined the linear aspects of Quake 1 and paved the way towards a
Hola, Big Titis, ¿qué tal?
to how Scourge of Armagon refined the linear aspects of Quake 1 and paved the way towards a more familiar future. The last original expansion for Quake 2, Ground Zero, is a much larger step backwards for the franchise and its gameplay than The Reckoning was a step forward. Developed by Rogue Entertainment, just like Strife and Dissolution of Eternity for Quake 1, I figured Ground Zero was gonna be great. Instead, it's possibly the most niche out of all of the early Quake campaigns. Dissolution of Eternity was experimental, unpredictable. Ground Zero is just overcomplicated and dense. Out of all the Quake 2 content, this expansion most closely resembles the disconnected, labyrinthine design of Quake 1. The Reckoning was focused on unit objectives, but in a way that felt in keeping with the main campaign of Quake 2. They were balanced objectives that helped the different levels cohere into a composite whole when the unit was done. Ground Zero's objectives are so complicated and constantly shifting that this cohesion is lost. Why do one thing when this can be split into 4 subsections? The levels, for the most part, are not meaningfully different from others in visual design. It's just the same boxes and rust as always. These boxes and rust just take so much longer than usual to get through. Quake 2 had mostly solved the issue of bizarre, overly obscure level progression that made Quake 1 so frequently frustrating. What seems to have happened is that Rogue tried to top themselves in a way that's out of step with Quake 2's actual strengths. It's an expansion that is much more complex than Dissolution of Eternity, and this just makes it slow as molasses in most places. The number one greatest convenience that the remastered version adds is a quest compass that actually works very well. I used it sporadically throughout the main campaign, mostly to understand the level transfer in the power plant unit. I used the compass more in The Reckoning, and in Ground Zero, I used that compass about once every 90 seconds to figure out where the fuck I was supposed to go. There's not a huge amount of interviews or documents around from those days, but a Rogue developer named Jim Molinets once wrote a level design process guide called Level Design Strategies and Pitfalls. There's a section called The Level of Detail Rule. It goes, quote, "The level of detail rule is something that is quite different for each designer, but basically this rule is
Hola, Lucay, ¿qué tal?
and pitfalls." There's a section called The Level of Detail Rule. It goes, quote, "The level of detail rule is something that is quite different for each designer, but basically this rule is a guideline for the designer to follow in case major changes are needed. Level of detail is basically designing the room or area in layers of detail that can be removed or changed as needed. If you can afford a giant fireplace with a great scrollwork mantle over it and the cathedral ceilings, then hey, that's perfect. However, if the room becomes too costly, then the designer must choose the layer of detail to change. Is the fireplace absolutely necessary? Can the ceiling be lowered to decrease size? What if the fireplace became a bookshelf instead? These are some of the options available, but all designers should remember that, in the end, nothing is sacred. As the constraints become more of an issue, the designer will be forced to delve deeper into the detail layer in order to accommodate changes. If the changes needed are drastic enough, the designer may be forced all the way back to the basic structure and layout of the area and forced to start fresh again." End quote. That's the contrast between the two expansion packs. The Reckoning sacrifices complexity of Labyrinth for visual spectacle, where Ground Zero has barely any visual spectacle at all to allow for maps dense enough to have 3 or 4 goals apiece. Even at the end, why just use a bomb when you could be asked to assemble that bomb from a casing and core that are kept in entirely different levels and areas of those levels? I have been resisting calling out Quake 2 for being an endless repetition of the same boring corridors, but that is genuinely what Ground Zero feels like. Hallways and boxes and locked doors, without purpose, without end. It's hard now to picture this being the dominant form of the game, but for a while, corridor shooters were a ubiquitous feature of the game market. They were like how open worlds with RPG progression and crafting became the standard today. It was an oversaturated format. Now, the tight linear FPS is much more rare. The new Wolfensteins, besides Youngblood, are notable for how they buck against the modern trends and return to the source format. But the new Wolfensteins are also highly cinematic, narratively driven. To focus only on the labyrinth is a narrow design philosophy, the narrowness of which is well demonstrated by Ground Zero. Alone, a maze cannot often stay exciting all on its own. It becomes rote, predictable even when a given solution is unknown. The only way to keep it truly fresh is through the only thing that can't be programmed: human interaction. At the bottom of the Strogg Castle in the main campaign is a secret museum of sorts. It contains within it the disembodied head of John Carmack, which then becomes an item that you can use. At the end of Doom 2, fellow developers hid John Romero's head behind the main boss in the place where you're meant to do damage. Romero's inclusion in Doom 2 is famous. Carmack's hidden head in Quake 2 is not. His head isn't even really the most important display in the hidden museum anyway. Instead, it's this out-of-place poster of Carmack in front of his first Ferrari. In 1997, in celebration of Quake 2's release, Carmack gave that exact Ferrari away as a prize for the Red Annihilation Deathmatch Tournament at the Electronic Entertainment Exposition. It was won by Dennis Fong, now recognized as one of the world's first professional esports players. Red Annihilation itself was one of the earliest major esports events. Before Fong won his match, Carmack addressed the crowd, saying, quote, "I bought my first Ferrari after the success of Wolfenstein 3D. Doom and Quake have bought me 3 more. 4 Ferraris is too many for me. Rather than sell off one of them or stick it in a warehouse, I'm gonna give it back to the gamers that brought it to me in the first place. The King of Quake Deathmatch is gonna get a really cool crown." End quote. And Fong did. He kept the car for 10 years. Fong even wrote the official strategy guide for Quake 2. Although Quake 2 has an actual narrative, a story to follow, the next iteration of Quake only makes sense with this story in mind, the story of how Quake and Doom didn't just establish what the first-person shooter is for an entire generation, they also built the entire concept of competitive esports from scratch. The very first major deathmatch tournament was put together by Microsoft for the launch party of Windows 95. Dennis...
¿Qué pasó? ¿Qué? ¿De eso? Muy bien. Espagueti. Me trajo espagueti. Bueno, eso no tengo que explicarlo, así que no lo explicaré, pero bueno. Tengo espagueti. Qué nice. Vino, ¿qué? Ya nadie dona el chat, perdió la voluntad de vivir. No, es que hay muchas horas y la gente piensa, no pasa nada, y bueno. Pero no te preocupes, ven. Digo, Albino. Y ven. No se preocupen. Se viene la gran detonación. No viene nada. Vamos a seguir poniendo esto.
Fong was there. In an interview with David Kushner, not from the book, but for Kushner's website in 2013, Fong recalls, quote, "I remember I was on stage. This was actually in the semifinals against an opponent who I thought was going to win the event. He was a very cocky individual. His name was Murloc. When I defeated him, I remember he slammed the keyboard and kicked the chair off the stage, basically. It had all the emotions that you would expect to see in a real sporting event, which is obviously what we see now with esports. It was the first time I really played in front of that many people, spectators on a stage. People were cheering. The opponent was raging and losing. It had all the feelings, like there was definitely something there. I would say that definitely that was a very seminal moment for me that said, hey, I think this has all the emotions and intensity and stress and entertainment of a real sport. I thought it really had a chance." End quote. And you know what? It really did. Quake 3 is a game built from that world, for that world, at the absolute exclusion of everything else. The story is much simpler than Quake 1 or 2, barely more than a basic hook. Eons ago, the Eternal Arena was built. Champions from across...
Acá está el espagueti.
Illusion of everything else. The story of that world, for that world, at the absolute exclusion of everything else. The story is much simpler than Quake 1 or 2, barely more than a basic hook. Eons ago, the Eternal Arena was built. Champions from across the universe are abducted to participate in its blood sport. You are one of these esteemed warriors. Quake 3 released in December of 1999. Half-Life's release the previous year had been the massive catalyst for change that Quake 2 had not been. Narrative was the new norm. Quake 3 completely defied that trend. It decided that the core of what Quake meant to people was not the strange, fractured fantasy worlds of Quake 1 or the military sci-fi of Quake 2. The core of Quake was deathmatch. So what Quake 3's...
Voy a comer... ¿Qué es esto? Espera, ¿de verdad no hablar de Quake Enemy Territory? Me voy a pegar un tiro. Voy a... ¿cómo se llama? Espagueti. Ahí está. Estoy enfermo. Ahí está. Eso. Ahora como.
His campaign does is introduce the maps one by one with bots of varying levels of challenge. At their highest level, these bots are meant to simulate actual human reaction speeds, but on the lower difficulties, this is toned down quite a bit. On the easier levels, the bots are just sheep to be sheared. On the medium levels, they're obviously artificial but provide some challenge. On the higher levels, they are shockingly aggressive. I didn't really bother to play above medium, for one somewhat insurmountable reason. I hate the way they move. I genuinely do. The way they simulate human movement in deathmatch is by being in a constant jittery motion, bouncing here and there, zigzagging always, jumping at random intervals. This is accurate to deathmatch, but also a reason I never really did get into multiplayer games very much. I have difficulty following and predicting these kinds of movements. Enemy AI in Quake 1 and 2 was never like this. Monster movement never is. The movement of enemies in a single-player setting is a way of characterizing these enemies. Encounter design relies on them behaving in consistent, predictable ways, with multiple enemy types in balance throughout a given encounter to create different flavors of challenge. Deathmatch is pure, twitchy reactivity. Deathmatch, to me, feels like a single flavor of challenge, and I don't even care for the taste. The levels of Quake 3 are divided into tiers, which have their own mostly distinct rosters of enemies to fight, but they never feel distinct. There are dozens of different enemies, or player types. The protagonists of Doom, Quake 1, and Quake 2 are all here, along with many variations on the aesthetics and themes, plus a lot of other characters with a dated, amusing edgelord vibe like zombie bikers and bikini vixens and an eyeball with legs. It's a menagerie of cast-off ideas and idea fragments, kind of like Quake 1 in a way. Nothing coheres, nothing fits well together, but not in nearly as interesting a way as Quake 1 failed to cohere. There aren't even weird complications like how the lore exposition in Quake 1 contradicts itself so constantly. There is no lore for Quake 3. Just fight! First to 10, first to 15, first to 20, on and on up the tiers. Who you fight doesn't really matter, only that you fight a little faster. With real humans behind these character models, that's a little different. At that point, the massive menagerie of opponents is a means of player self-expression. Who you choose becomes a statement of sorts. Silly, sexy, grotesque, masculine. While the modern hero shooter is distinct because all the hero characters play differently, and all Quake 3 characters play the same, there is still some small hint of what's to come. For all these new subgenres to flourish, game modes beyond deathmatch would have to gain popularity. Modes its direct competitor had already implemented in many ways, right after Quake 3 was released. Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament were in development at the exact same time, unaware of their rivals' existence until they were released. Unreal Tournament came out 1 month earlier, on November 30th, 1999. It was, itself, a multiplayer-only sequel to a previously single-player-oriented game, but Unreal Tournament contained so much more than just deathmatch. Capture the flag, objectives-driven assault mode. There was so much more thought given to the possibilities of play in a 3D environment than what Quake 3 represents. Quake 3 is primarily a refinement of the community that had grown up with Quake since the first one, oriented around deathmatch exclusively, for the most part. In 1996, a mod for Quake 1 called Team Fortress was developed. It wouldn't really take off until it was remade for Half-Life as Team Fortress Classic. After that, It would get a major retail version called Team Fortress 2, cementing a path where the hero shooter as a concept would finally become a major popular pillar of the esports community. It all goes back to Quake. But id, as a developer, did not embrace the full spectrum of possibility presented by its creation. Quake 3 has faster, meaner, more refined deathmatch gameplay than Unreal Tournament. It just doesn't have much of anything else. A highly specialized product for a highly specialized gaming community. id crunched in the following year to add the kind of game modes that Unreal Tournament had at launch, resulting in the much maligned Team Arena expansion. It's not that Team Arena is terrible, it's just that it only does this very basic task of adding capture the flag and such, and nothing else, with some new weapons or old weapons like the classic nail gun, which seems unnecessary because the plasma gun was basically nail gun 3.0 anyway. There is no single player mode at all for Team Arena, not even a tiered one. No expansion of the world or the lore, just a last-ditch attempt to close distance with a competitor whose vision was wider. Nothing about Quake 3, the way it is, appeals to me very much at all. Where Quake 2...
Vos sos Quake, Quake Gear y yo soy un Real Tournament Boy. ¡Qué asco! Hola, Calenita. Invita un poco. Sí, haré Quake 3 después de terminar el 2. Tengo que terminarme las expansiones y la expansión hecha por Machine Games y Quake 64 y ya está. Me gustaría hacer eso. Pero ahora estoy en modo... A ver... Y eso.
Nothing about Quake 3, the way it is, appeals to me very much at all. Where Quake 2 was criticized for having no atmosphere, I tried to dig underneath to find what was redeeming. Here, with Quake 3, there is simply nothing underneath. The technical advances no longer shine, the art feels washed out and flat. Quake 3 feels like it's missing half of itself without a single-player campaign that's more than bot matches. Quake 3 so confidently threw out the whole concept of a narrative because it thought that the future was deathmatch. But the next generation of id games pivoted entirely. In the mid-2000s, for both Doom and Quake, the future was narrative. The id Tech 4 engine was one of the most dramatic leaps forward in gaming technology that I've seen in my lifetime, as startling in its own way as the id Tech 2 Quake engine was in 1996. As dramatic as the technology was, it only ever wound up in a handful of games. Doom 3 rebooted Doom as a slower-paced, atmospheric horror FPS. Wolfenstein was rebooted in 2009 as an inconsistent though ambitious shooter with a semi-open world. An alien abduction shooter called Prey shared strong horror themes in common with Doom 3, plus a few smaller id Tech 4 titles. And then, Quake 4. Quake 4 ignores both Quake 1 and Quake 3 entirely to create a full-throated sequel of the second game's war against the Strogg. It picks up right where the last one left off, with the defeat of the Macron, allowing humans to jump in more ships and resupply the war effort. You're part of that second wave. Rather than pre-rendered cutscenes, everything is done in-engine, showing off the engine's muscle. In hindsight, the dramatic focus of Quake 4 highlights the fact that, as amazing as the engine was with texture and shadow, it never did get faces right. There's a particularly plastic look to the faces in this generation of id games that I do find kind of charming. Gaming used to be full of strange contradictions like that, games with good textures and bad faces versus games with good faces and flat textures. It wasn't so homogeneous as it is today. But the cinematic naturalism of today's games was the inevitable convergence point of all these many early attempts at making 3D spaces come alive. Quake 4, like Doom 3, plays much slower than its predecessors and is much more concerned with atmosphere. The difference between them is largely format. In Quake 2 and in Doom 3, you are always alone. The game sometimes teased you that you were meeting up with other squads, but they would always die in front of you, or you arrive just too late. It happened so often in Quake 2 and its expansions as to basically be a running gag. In Quake 4, you have companion characters in many of the levels. It works better without them, so the game sends you out alone for the majority of your time, but there's never an hour that goes by where you don't interact with NPCs within the actual environment of the level. Atmospheric horror is what the engine does best. Giving up that atmospheric horror, I think, is why Quake 4 is thought of as the least of these initial releases. Replacing that horror with what seems at first like a very straightforward military sci-fi plot just doesn't have the personality of Doom 3's supernaturally decaying Mars base, or Prey's interest in making you feel lost in a giant alien biomass. Quake 4 does not really deserve its reputation as the bland one, as much as it initially seems at least. The thing that throws people is that Quake 4 gets off to a very slow creative start. The game spends a great deal of time establishing what normal conflict against the Strogg looks like so that it can then escalate and complicate the story. Once the twist kicks in, the game settles into a really fantastic and creative rhythm. It's just not obvious because at first, the game's interest is in re-establishing the setting, assuming, perhaps correctly, that in the nearly 8 years since Quake 2, there would be few who remembered the old fight against the Macron. Quake 4 was developed primarily by Raven Software, who first began working with id way back in the 90s with their Hexen and Heretic dark fantasy shooters, games that had a lot in common with Quake 1 tonally. Raven, however, followed a different path later on as a developer. After working with id on Wolfenstein 2009, Raven began working as a support developer for the Call of Duty franchise. So it's not...
No, aún le quedaba la última bala, que era Singularity.
Raven began working as a support developer for the Call of Duty franchise. So it's not just Zatrix Grey Matter who made a Quake campaign influenced by World War II moods and imagery, and then went on to just make war shooters permanently. It happened to Raven as well. There's a whole secret Quake to Call of Duty pipeline that I never would have known about if I hadn't started trying to figure out how the hell such a complicated odd series got that way in the first place. It serves also, I think, to illustrate how Quake 4 begins in a way that feels overfamiliar to a lot of people. It had been a long 8 years since Quake 2 asked...
¿Qué estás viendo, mamó? ¿Cómo argumentar un debate? ¡Qué asco! ¿Qué pasa, papá? ¿Te arde la cola? A ver si mi novia me mandó un mensajillo. No. Che, igual el plato, esto no es crítica. El plato es masivo, ¿eh? O sea, es una bandeja de pasta gigantesca. Me voy a morir. Ya está, pero bueno. Sigo viendo lo de Quake 4 que está rico.
Asked, what if Guns of Navarone, except Navarone is a badass space fortress? The cliché of the soldier being separated from their squad, having to fight through a hard landing, this had already been used in everything from Half-Life Opposing Force to Call of Duty itself. Introducing the squad one by one with the protagonist as...
Puras quejas, no vuelvo a comprar nada. ¡No me quejo! ¡Qué asco! No, ni siquiera me quejé. Solamente no... Es muy grande el plato. No... me voy a morir. Y eso. Por lo demás, gracias, mi amor. Y está rico. Está bueno. Gracias, de verdad, gracias. No era necesario. No tenías que hacerlo porque no pasa nada. Pero muchas gracias por hacerlo. Y gracias por la pasta. Y no dije... No dije que te lo acabaras. ¡Qué asco! No, pero uno usualmente, para mostrar el agradecimiento, se acaba la cosa. Ahí, limpia el plato. Pero bueno. Control de daños, qué asco. ¡Ah!
As the rookie who has to prove themselves, this is as by template as it gets. The first level plays it absolutely by the book, and it was a book that anyone who was into shooters at the time, or now, would have read many times over. But then Quake 4 does something very interesting for a shooter like it at the time. It introduces a non-combat hub level. Your ship drops from orbit, providing a mobile barracks, command center, and staging area. A player can rush straight to briefing, or, for the first time in franchise history, pick up detailed information about the setting's mood and technology by listening in on ambient conversations. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it is grounding. It creates a sense of human stakes and casual believability. It's not self-consciously a game the way Quake 2 was with its kill counts and secret counters, its division of named levels into discrete units. Quake 4 has definite chapters to it, but the narrative experience runs on cinema logic and not arcade logic. Quake 4 cares about immersion. That's why it wants a slow start. Because by the time you see this ship again, the context for who your character is and how they're treated will change completely. For that future story beat to land, a baseline of normality has to be established. It even uses the pretense of a wartime newscast to recap the events of Quake 2. Simple as they are, the newscast adequately condenses the entire game into about 30 seconds. There is a craft and a care to the world building in Quake 4 that's obvious even so many years later, even if it is ultimately mostly conveyed over a 20-minute interlude. Doom 3 also introduced a lot of narrative beats and world building compared to previous titles in the series, but Doom 3 does it in a way that is borderline ironic, melding the satanic and the demonic with a banal corporate sterility. Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal both borrowed from Doom 3 that way. Quake 4 is different. It is straightforward and sincere. So there is no irony, no layer of metatextual commentary. Even Prey was comparatively playful with its tone and influences. Quake 4's only interest is in taking Quake 2 and making it more fundamentally cinematic, a focus that's unambitious in retrospect, but...
Te digo con un poquito más.
Dame.
Bueno. ¿Lo probaste? Mira, pruébalo.
No, si te lo entregué todo cerrado.
Cierto, soy un choto. Pruébalo. Dime qué tal.
Está bien. Bajo. Esto es tuyo. No me voy.
Bueno. Cariño, ¿de cuánto esto es una sola porción? ¿O qué onda? Ah, corazón. Ah, listo. Bueno, después ahora bueno, termino y lo cierro.
Si quieras, no lo vas a pagar.
Siempre.
surprisingly more fundamentally cinematic, a focus that's unambitious in retrospect.
Kinder Surprise Egg, a quite astonishing commodity. The surprise of this excessive object, the cause of your of your desire, is here materialized in the gaze of object which fills in the inner void of the chocolate egg. The whole delicate balance is between these two dimensions. What you bought, the chocolate egg, and the surplus, probably made in some Chinese gulag or whatever, that you get for free. I don't think that the chocolate frame is here to send you on a deeper voyage toward the inner treasure, the what Plato calls the agalma, which makes you a worthy person, which makes you a commodity, desirable commodity. I think is the other way around. The short, ahí está. The short aim at the higher gold. The gold in the middle of the object, precise in order to be able to enjoy the surface. Malísimo mi inglés. igual que el de Sisek. Pero increíble. Una maravilla. Y la toxiqueada es lo que está en el medio ahí. Cáncer. Pero sí, ahí tenemos la cosa. La de 100 bits está ahí. Bueno, le doy play.
Respect, but surprisingly compelling if you are one of the few bizarre weirdos like me who played Quake 2 for the story. Fundamentally cinematic, a focus that's unambitious in retrospect, but surprisingly compelling if you are one of the few bizarre weirdos like me who played Quake 2 for the story.
Sí.
The first third of the game hews to that familiar, standardized war shooter format. Even within that limited format, though, are some really memorable, excellent sequences, like the modestly named Perimeter Defense Station. This is a level with a completely self-contained arc of progression. It begins quiet, a momentary foothold for tactical coordination and medical aid on the way to grander Strogg facilities, and it stays quiet for a significant amount of time, letting the player get quite deep into the facility. Then, the counterattack. Your position overrun, the situation deteriorates in mere moments. There's a lot of excellent scripted deaths and scripted ambushes that are every bit as clever and gory as the ones in Doom 3. You loop back around to the entrance, and by the time you do, you're the last one there. It feels like an older Quake level because of this recursive design, while also demonstrating what an impressive, modern presentation it had for the time of its release. All in one compact 20-minute sequence. The Tetranode, your destination for this chapter, is even more impressive. It's got some genuinely excellent moments of visual sci-fi. The structure itself has a great deal of personality, all blue-lit and cold. This is what id Tech 4 did best, this kind of intricate and dense industrial look. The big reveal isn't much of a much. Oh no, a new Macron! Maybe he'll be a coconut one this time. It's the bait and switch that's significant. You can't win this boss fight. You fail, are captured, and when you wake up, you are one of those poor Marines who were tortured and processed into goo back in Quake 2's medical dungeons. The Strogification scene of Quake 4 is, I think, an all-time great moment in horror gaming. It uses the first-person perspective and the on-rails design of the sequence to create a feeling of tangible hopelessness and helplessness. You're visibly wounded in ways that are quite obviously close to fatal. It doesn't take much to imagine the pain being endured here, and the sound design backs that up with aggressive machinery noises and saw whirring. Where a movie like Hostel uses gore and torture of others to provoke nausea and discomfort, Quake 4 makes it more personal and more intense with this first-person perspective by leveraging the time you've already spent identifying as Matthew Caine and learning his short backstory. Quake 4, unfortunately...
¿Qué pasó?
Nada, voy con el nano.
Bueno. Uy.
identifying as Matthew Caine and learning his short backstory. Quake 4 unfortunately kind of peaks at this moment. It is so visceral and so compelling, and while the back two-thirds of the game are better than the front third, the game just never surprises as art like this again. When your squad breaks you out just before the mind control is activated, the Call of Duty vibe continues, just altered a little. Like how you can read the Strogg language now, all the signage swims around into a much more legible font when you look at it now. And you can use Strogg healing stations. Plus you get a durability boost from being as much metal as flesh. It shakes it up. But consider the boss fight with your squad's CO, Voss. Voss gets Stroggified also, but in a way identical as...
A ver, sí, lo voy a decir, que es idéntico al jefe de Doom 3. Y el de por ahí, lo tengo que decir. Yo sé que él lo sabe, tiene que saberlo. Hay gente que no lo sabe, yo lo sé, y no quiero estar solo.
CO, Voss. Voss gets Stroggified also, but in a way identical as a plot beat and almost identical as a monster to a fight from both Doom 3 and Prey.
Ah.
Doom 3 faces you off versus Commander Kelly, one of the only friendly voices.
Sí, él le sabe, bien. Qué bien que se siente cuando a mitad del juego te dan un power-up y podés usar cosas que antes sí.
And Prey. Doom 3 faces you off versus Commander Kelly, one of the only friendly voices in the game, until he gets all demony and stuff. Prey has a boss fight against Jen, your character's girlfriend, and the driver of much of your progression through the giant living spaceship. Prey came out a year later, true, but next to each other, it is odd that all three games feature such close variations on that particular moment. Quake 4's version is indeed the least of them, which holds true for, admittedly, a lot of things, big and small, across its whole production. What I mainly wish is that Quake 4 had gone harder than it did with the ideas that it had, like the planet of Strogos and the Strogg environments. In Quake 2, the color was this deep and angry red. Doom 3's Mars had already claimed red as the dominant landscape color for this game generation, though, so Quake 4 pivoted backwards to beige.
Huh?
The Strogg are meant to be this ultra-industrialized civilization who have utterly ruined their planet, and that comes through only some of the time, not nearly to the extent that it could have. In my mind, the setting was one of the strongest elements of Quake 2, one of the essential pillars of its personality as a game. Here, the game actually suffers for its use of id Tech 4. It's an incredible engine as far as architectural detail and light is concerned, but about the only thing it does worse than faces is landscapes. Just like Quake 2, the most...
Sí, es una crítica que ha recibido el Editech, de que no puede hacer, es incapaz de hacer exteriores, más allá de que lo quería demostrar que se podía hacer. Echad de miedo a tomen metafetamina. ¿Qué? Hola, ¿qué? ¿Qué? Más allá de que se quería demostrar que se podía hacer, se hizo, no de la mejor manera. Y por eso ahí Carmack se obsesionó con las megatexturas y con hacer entornos gigantescos. Y ahí nació Rage, de una enorme... Para mí, esta es mi visión de crítico subjetivo, de una enorme crítica al motor de Doom, que era experto en hacer espacios cerrados. No podía hacer espacios abiertos. John Carmack dijo, ah, sí, tomá. E hizo Rage. ID Software hizo Rage, perdón. Y bueno. Y ahí salió ID Tech 5. Y ID Tech 5 salió recontra roto, pero... Bueno. Una pena. Pero esto, sí, el ID Tech... Igual... Antes de eso, Karma quería demostrar que Splash Damage hizo Quake Wars, Enemy Territory Quake Wars, y ahí se demostró que sí podían hacer entornos enormes, utilizando la tecnología de megatexturas de Karma. Y eso que Tech 4 con las megatexturas no sufre de lo que sufre Rage, de la pobre definición y de, o sea, limitado en su tiempo. Está limitado por su tiempo, pero de la pobre definición y el popeo. Quake Wars no lo sufre. Nada, cero. Es invulnerable a eso. Y me da tristeza Rage. Algún día conseguiré, no sé, o lo harán con IA, descomprimirán Rage y les pondrán las texturas como debe ser. No sé, la pasé piola con Quake 4. No, Quake 4 está lindo, está nice. Al chabón este le encanta, pero está criticando el hecho de que Quake 4 sufre por usar el ID Tech. Hola, ¿qué Elcita? Hola.
Tech 4. It's an incredible engine as far as architectural detail and light is concerned, but about the only...
Ah, Marcos, mirá. Me llegó la Ushanka. Felicidades. Soy un cliché. ¿Qué tal? Bueno, eso. Listo. Y también me llegó la vestimenta de Old Omega. No te lo saques más. Viajo a Argentina con eso y me matan. ¿Ese era el cosplay? No, ese no era el cosplay. El cosplay de Omega está ahí, pero lo voy a usar cuando esté Farfa. Regresé de flexiar la pala y del psiquiatra. Perfecto. Estamos viendo una review de todos los Quake.
only thing it does worse than faces is landscapes. Just like Quake 2, the most beautiful vistas of Quake 4 are all accomplished through skyboxes, and not the actual level itself. The worst parts of Quake 4 are the traversal levels, where you have to spend time out and about in these rendered outdoor areas. The areas are never anything more than fishbowls and corridors of varying sizes and shapes, and the vehicle combat is simple, irritating, and completely unnecessary as an inclusion. Half-Life 2 had come out the winter before Quake 4 was released in 2004. Perhaps these levels are some sort of stapled-on response to Half-Life 2, to the sense of scale that overland sections in Half-Life 2 create. It's not like the original campaign of Half-Life 2 had a huge amount of landscape detail either, but Valve did it so much more artfully, just like they had in 1998. Quake 4's outdoors feels so lifeless and so slight that they detract from the overall presentation, no matter how cool piloting a mech sounds on paper. I feel like this could have been an opportunity to do some very cool visual world building, to genuinely surpass Quake 2 by showing off a kind of player's journey that the earlier game could not. Quake 4 wants the sense of scale that Quake 2 tried to create in its between-unit cinematics, it just executes very awkwardly on the idea. The middle part of the game is the worst offender, where the pacing sags like crazy as you attempt to reach a faraway extraction point. But even this most mediocre part of the game has high points. Quake 4 is neither good nor bad for long, it's always weaving from one to another. Within a slog of forgettable environments is the Waste Processing Center, where you must kill a grotesque monster who processes the waste within the vastness of its gut. It is a memorable creature design. The level design becomes memorable for how you navigate around the big fella, in moodily lit waste pits and drains filled with body parts, blood, and viscera.
Qué buena.
In moodily lit, the level design becomes memorable for how you navigate around the big fella, in moodily lit waste pits and drains filled with body parts, blood, and viscera. Old forgotten barrels contain failed marine to Strahd conversions. Zombies, effectively. This switches up the flavor, pacing, and tone of the mechanical encounters while leveraging the lighting system to create very dark and anxious moods. It's not a long sequence, but it is a sequence that breaks up the rhythm effectively at the exact moment it begins to feel pretty stale. After this long, irritating middle is your return to the command ship. A not at all triumphant return. People take one look at you and your new body and despise what you have become. The fact that you lived makes it worse for them. Why you? Why not all the friends and loved ones who were turned into monsters and paced without even the chance to resist? It's a tremendous story beat for what Quake 4 actually is. Short, unfortunately, but incredibly compelling. It's the twist that Quake 4 needed. to take that classic war story vibe and add some of the classic downbeat features of older war stories, that skepticism of how war changes a person, the resentment that builds against those who survive by those who have experienced the full weight of loss. Upper Command, however, is more than happy to use you as the tool you are. In the last third of the game, you take it from the top to execute one massive, sprawling mission. You will destroy the Macron and the entire Strog communications network in one coordinated strike. Insertion begins in a Quake 2 style drop pod flying through the air before crashing into a tall tower to begin the assault.
A veces cuando veo estas cosas pienso en el guión que me gustaría escribir hablando de cuando veo estas cosas me da ganas de escribir y todo eso. Pero nada, yo si escribiese en este aspecto y mostrase esta parte, también diría, mira, qué PNG masivo, todo eso. También haría el argumento de, nada, es culpa de Quake, es culpa de IDTech y que no puede renderizar escenarios grandes. Una pena. Pero ahí yo diría, no sé, cosas como que John Carmack se ardió y agarró y empezó a crear el motor de Rage. Y ahí, pero tendría que hacerle ahí corte y una pequeña sección llamada Karma que está ardido y ahí explicar la transición de esto a Rage y cómo cambió todo en ID Software a causa de los problemas del ID Tech. Hacelo. No, porque primero si voy a hacer algo lo haré con Quake 2. Y tengo que terminar la cosa con Rage, así que a esperar.
Pod flying through the air before crashing into a tall tower to begin the assault. What makes all this so good is the pacing. The objectives are accomplished quickly, with purpose, and putting them all at the top of these towers creates a true sense of scale where you look from one to the other and see what you've already done. A boss begins chasing you around the time that you're climbing the second tower, culminating in a big fight at the top of the third tower. Things move so quickly, the encounter design is so aggressive, the sense of progress and accomplishment so tangible. This is just excellent FPS campaign design, period. It comes at the end, though, a consistency that simply isn't present in the first 66% of the actual game experience. A lot of people made up their minds about Quake 4 long before the game seems to have made up its mind about itself. Doom 3 rocks it from level 1 by contrast. It's more focused on both the technology and the pacing of the campaign, clearer with the mood, snappier with the scares. Quake 4 struggles to compare favorably to its peers within the limited pool of id Tech games. The best of Quake 4 is in how it adapts and remakes Quake 2, which is a much more limited, particular definition of success. In the last third, Quake 4 nails every one of those particulars. The biomechanical horror is pervasive and wonderfully gross. The vibe is very World War II, despite or perhaps because of the sci-fi filter. The combat is peak aggression with a mix of many types of enemies at once, with a full arsenal to murder them with, including the good old nail gun and other staples from the Quake franchise. Nostalgic adaptations and remakes are such a common part of the modern gaming landscape, so it's especially interesting to consider Quake 4 as one of the early examples of a game franchise going through that process of rebirth. It isn't even a full decade between the release of Quake 1 in 1996 and Quake 4 in 2005. Within the space of that decade, 3D gaming as we know it today was invented, refined, made into a sport, and then the 3D tech gets pushed so far forward that the fourth game looks like it came from a totally different game development timeline. The industry never moved so fast as the turn of the millennium. The differences between games in 1996 and games in 2005 is a broader gulf than the difference between games from 2005 and 2023. Quake is there for every major step of transition, not as the best games or the most classic games. Quake is, instead, the connective tissue that holds the fabric of this period of game development together. Quake is gristle and muscle, chewy and strange. As game development moved past this era of rapid change and settled into a more stable corporate era, this has made Quake increasingly difficult to reboot or remake the way they did it all the way back in 2005, which makes this game's last lines particularly ironic. You've had your victory over Macron 2.0, the day is yours. They could have just left it there, but no. The big brass rolls in, congratulates you, and growls not to get too comfortable because there's another mission waiting. Which there was. It would just be another 11 years before it came out. and it came out for Quake 1. For Quake's 20th anniversary in 2016, a brand new official map pack was released made entirely by one person. Jerk Gustafsson, actual name, serious job, is one of the founding members of Machine Games, the developers behind the new Wolfenstein reboots. Between releasing the New Order and the new Colossus, Gustafsson made time to celebrate Quake's 20th anniversary by releasing Dimension of the Past, a set of Quake levels with the express intention to revisit that very chaotic, primordial era of level design and game feel. This is so fascinating to me because of what the new Wolfensteins themselves represent. The most narrative-centric, word-heavy, emotionally intelligent adaptation of an early id title to date. The new Wolfensteins are creatively so much more confident and clever of a franchise reboot than Quake 4 was in its era. And yet, Gustafsson had this creative impulse to move completely backwards from that modern conception of an FPS campaign to make this level set that has no plot, no dialogue, no narrative whatsoever, except for the sense of personal authorship that Quake 1's various worlds provided. Gustafsson made, 20 years after the fact, World 5 for Quake 1. What's remarkable about it, and why I imagine it was made an official 20th anniversary release, is that Gustafsson completely nailed it. There are some differences in the player experience, like how it's a lot stingier with health and ammunition than the...
¿Qué opinas? Pues un poco complejo, la verdad. Son asteriscos, son 3, están ahí solos, sin ningún tipo de contexto. Cuando es algo, ¿viste cuando algo es tan simple que no puedo decir nada porque no agregarías nada? Porque es algo tan simple, tan directo que... Y también confuso, o sea, como algo abstracto. Está ahí, directo, confuso, abstracto, existo, lo ves, lo analizás, uy, no puedo aportar nada. Así que, ¿qué puedo opinar de esos 3 asteriscos? Nada. Lo siento. No aportaría nada.
The original campaigns. Dimension of the Past feels balanced around Quake experts and not the general interest balance the original campaign had on normal difficulty. My feeling is that this is fine, since for the most part, it is only Quake experts who get this deep into the franchise anyway. I'm just here because I'm stubborn, and the quick save feature is basically a superpower. It is well worth it to try and persist, however, because what Gustafsson has mastered is the pattern of level design that defines Quake 1 so specifically. Every level is a variation on the recursive maze design, where there are no wrong directions, not really, and the true path snakes in and out of every part of the level, connecting them in surprising and clever ways. In one level, the gold and silver keys are placed above the opposite colored doors at the very beginning of the level, teasing you. Getting them is a considerably more complicated affair, and then there's a whole wing of the level after those keys are found. Dimension of the Past is not just an imitation of the kind of level design that gave Quake 1 its unique, peculiar personality, it is a fine accomplishment of its own within that template. I might always feel like Vors are cheap as hell in any given encounter personally, but that is part of Quake 1's spirit of sadism. It's just mean as hell to the player in clever, darkly comedic ways, has been ever since Romero touched it. Take this excellent key trap. Damn thing killed me like 10 times before I figured out where the buttons to turn it off are. Dimension of the Past beautifully illustrates what I've been trying to talk about regarding level design as its own kind of art, its own particular way of communicating emotion and mood to the player. Dimension of the Past feels just as personal and individualistic a work as Willett's, Romero, McGee, and Peterson's levels felt in the original campaign, while also feeling in keeping with the rhythms and expectations established by those older artists. Dimension of the Past deserves its place as World 5. At minimum, this 20th anniversary release is a far better tribute to the series than some kind of convoluted, corporatized live service sequel would be. Quake Champions, released in 2017 as an early access title and not officially finished until 2022, is exactly that convoluted cash factory of a title. At its core, it is Quake 3 with really nice graphics, and it didn't have to be more than that. Yet, it is everything on top of that. Quake Champions is a game drowning in live service progression systems that encourage constant engagement with petty rewards and prizes. Quake 3 lets you be a weird little eyeball guy right off the bat. Quake Champions makes you grind for it. It hopes you'll pay for a random loot crate to drop the little eyeball guy as an epic prize. This is annoying, but not fundamentally devastating to the game. More than other live service titles, Quake Champions is perfectly playable without spending a dime on it. It's free to play without engaging in the freemium aspects at all. And the part that is free is, Quake 3, but with modern aesthetics. There had been other Quake multiplayer spin-offs like 2007's Enemy Territory Quake Wars, but that game was completely shut down. Quake Live was Quake 3, but in your web browser, no installation needed. Since 2010, Quake 3 Arena has been essentially free for...
Ah, ya sé, porque el tipo no puede jugar Quake Wars, porque piensa que murió. Como no puede acceder a él, no puede hablar de él. Pero él subestima a mi comunidad. Él no sabe que yo soy el rey de Quake Wars y he, en mi peak, llenado un servidor. En mi peak. Ahora estoy... no lo tiene nadie, pero... En mi pick logré llenar uno. Y fue increíble. Fue maravilloso. Todo el mundo se divirtió y lo amaron. Así que... bueno. Supongo que yo puedo hacer algo que él no. Llenar un servidor.
For anyone via this Quake Live version. Quake Champions is different because with its live service progression systems, it is demonstrably a different game from a different era. Not just Quake... for Quake's sake. Demonstrably a different game from a different era, not just Quake for Quake's sake. It reminds me a little of the Team Arena expansion that way. It's a bolt-on addition to Quake that tries to add in what's hot now, in this case, hero shooter elements and loot boxes. What's very funny is that as part of the many unlockables, one of those unlockable categories is lore. Like for the Ranger, protagonist of Quake 1, default starting dude of Quake Champions. Ranger's lore is done up like diary entries. Our boy writes, quote, "The place was a maze. It was like the worst dream I've ever had, but I know how to follow orders. I just had to find Quake and kill it. No time to think about what the hell I was seeing. Why was the facility laid out like a death trap? What about those psycho Marines, the poor bastards? Who did that to them? Doesn't make any sense. I was fighting for my life as soon as I got there, and then things kept getting darker and weirder. There were other slip gates, and I went through them, nowhere else to go. No idea where they were leading to. I just shot anything that moved, and I've been shooting ever since." End quote. Here we are, 27 years after the fact, still trying to grapple within the franchise with just how little of a shit the first game gave about any kind of narrative sense at all. This lore says Quake is old shubs, but that's just conveniently leaving out all the other nonsense the expansions dumped on top of it, and much of what Quake 1 actually had to say for itself in the first place. Mostly, Quake Champions just wants a long explanation for why Ranger has his particular hero power. This retcon is hidden in the margins of Quake Champions because litigating what the first game was actually about is basically impossible. And I love that. Since I don't really even enjoy Quake 3 in its standard open form, I definitely didn't care for it wrapped up in a fancy Skinner box of live service elements. What I wanted was more Quake 2 or more Quake 4. Strog shit. Single-player campaigns. And for a long time, the only thing that even might have scratched that itch within the official releases was the version of Quake 2 they put out for the Nintendo 64. Night Dive's remasters include the N64 version of both Quake 1 and Quake 2, but only Quake 2's version is notable. Like Doom 64, it actually is a whole new set of levels produced by Midway Games. What's interesting to me is how, when Midway did Doom 64, it leaned into that game's darker elements a little more. It made the monsters a little nastier. Quake 2 64 leans the opposite direction.
¿Qué pasa? ¿Mr. Starsoul es una amenaza? ¿Es una amenaza? ¿Me estás amenazando? ¿Acaso piensas que no puedo irme cuando yo quiera? ¿Acaso piensas que no tengo el control de mi vida?
Making things much brighter and more cartoonish. It is still dark and industrial in parts, but the N64 version has almost none of what landed the tone or setting of the original game. Sometimes to the point that it feels more like Commander Keen but mean than it feels like Quake 2. Yet that's kind of what makes it charming. Instead of the cutscenes showing a player moving from place to place with a moody green wireframe, the N64 version uses a placemat art map to show how all the levels are connected and your journey between them. Within those levels, there are some things it does that are more ambitious than the original Quake 2 campaign, like how it pulls from the Reckoning and has you steal a spaceship to move from one facility to another. If, as Chris Franklin suggested, the early Quakes are primarily mood pieces, then looking at an alternative version of the game where the mood is completely incorrect for the setting illuminates quite a bit. The N64 campaign is still fun, the gameplay rhythm still hit. It is still Quake in the playing of it, which gives the whole campaign an uncanny feeling where its fundamental emphasis on bloodthirsty, heavy-impact violence feels unsupported by the arcade sci-fi environments. If the tone of the violence was lighter, the levels would fit better. They're not bad levels at all. More than just stealing a spaceship, the campaign takes the better parts of the expansions and incorporates them well. Some of the objectives and scripted moments are similar to moments from the original campaign, like aligning these communication dishes, but the look of them is so busy and so bright in comparison to the original presentation, it feels like its own thing. Some things are more Quakey, like this mid-game boss fight that adheres to the boss appearance template laid down by Quake 2 and its expansions. Pretty much anything to do with the combat itself feels like it always has, meaty and mean. Some things just don't land the same way at all, though, like the Strogg torture room levels. Sure, there's this instance of lowering a cage of poor guys into lava, but the environment isn't nearly as brutally industrial as it was in the original campaign. It is easy to criticize the inescapable brown earth tones of the original Quake 2 campaign, but in witnessing the exact opposite approach within an actual official campaign, it becomes clear how well the muted palette of the original helped sell the mood of the setting. Quake 2 64 also does nothing to solve the essential conundrum of the franchise that's led to such fractured, divergent titles. What makes Quake Quake? Because the gameplay, even in the N64 version, or the remastered version of it at least, is more reactive and more actively enjoyable than the gunplay in Quake 4. Gunplay in Quake 4 is fine, adequate, it's just not as fast, not as rhythmic. It doesn't have quite the right flow that even Quake 2 64 has. What made Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal so remarkable is their return to that flow. But that leaves Quake out in the cold as just some multiplayer hero shooter, safely on a side stage so as not to pull focus. Consider Dimension of the Past. The best modern follow-up to Quake at this point had not been a reboot or a remake or a modernization, it was just more Quake. More of what made the original game special and unique. More of the art style that defined them in their era of their release, free from modern gloss and RTX-enabled beard stubble. id and Bethesda seem to have arrived at this exact conclusion, because when Night Dive Studios released their remasters of the games in 2021 and 2023, they released them with brand new campaigns for each title by the full Machine Game Studio, actual sequels to the foundational Quakes in every aspect. Night Dive Studios took Quake 1 and 2 and transferred them from the old id tech that drove them to their flexible, modular Kex engine. Kex allows developers who are still making levels for older titles to use a massive array of modern lighting tricks, and to build levels that are considerably larger than anything originally possible. The Machine Games campaigns, Dimension of the Machine for Quake 1 and Call of the Machine for Quake 2, make full use of all of these contemporary creative possibilities. They each take the base experience and aesthetic of the original games and intensify those things to their most extreme limits. The new all of these contemporary creative possibilities. They each take the base experience and aesthetic of the original games and intensify those things to their most extreme limits. The new campaign.
Hola gente, a reducir los problemas de la alta tensión y baja tensión eléctrica. Menos mal que no se descompuso la heladera. Buenísimo. Y ahí banda al culo. Ah, no, no es banda al culo. ¿Qué era? Es Among Us Vandal. Sí, Vandal As. Pero bueno, qué bueno que no se descompuso. Y hola Rick.
Campaigns never become completely detached from the old rhythms of play, though. They carefully tease out and intensify elements of the old campaigns instead. It has been surprisingly difficult to find information about the development of these two new Quake games. There's a series of interviews on Bethesda's website called Nods to Mods, one of which features Machine Games developer Christian Growert. He said that it began as kind of an in-office side project coming out of the office Quake Club. Quote, "We also have our weekly Quake Club at Machine Games where we try to keep ourselves entertained by showing off things that we make. It started up as just a way for us level designers to flex our design muscles outside of work, but we ended up creating a fantastic release with Dimension of the Machine. I'm super proud of us managing to pull that off when a lot of our team members had never even played Quake before." End quote. And yeah, kudos to the Quake Club indeed. Dimension of the Machine has levels that are just as difficult as Dimension of the Past, but the whole thing is much more visually impressive and well-paced. For one, it uses a modified Quake 2 style structure with 5 units of 2 gigantic levels. Each unit is a different sort of world with a different sort of vibe, and like the worlds of Quake 1's original campaign, they can all be played in any order until all are beaten and the boss unlocks. The levels are so massive that each unit takes around 40 to 60 minutes. It is likely that it will take a given player longer to complete the new campaign than the original 1996 campaign. It is absolutely, genuinely a full-ass sequel to the original, and I cannot believe it hasn't made much of an impact that way. This is Quake 5, and then Quake 6 for Call of the Machine. It's absolutely wild how much creative effort and developmental sweat went into the creation of Dimension of the Machine. So why is it buried within the remaster instead of getting some sort of independent, full release? One reason, I think, is that it mostly makes sense in dialogue with the original. It would be very confusing to modern expectations if it was labeled Quake 5. This would suggest the same treatment that Doom and Wolfenstein got. No matter how much of a legitimate sequel Dimension of the Machine ends up being, it isn't a forward movement for the franchise, it's a backwards expedition into its roots from a modern lens. A successful expedition, but too far astray from what people think of when they think sequel to be marketed that way. Sequel is the word, though. A nostalgic work would seek to recreate. Dimension of the Machine surpasses the original at every turn, using Quake 1's own established language of combat and environment. Nostalgia isn't supposed to wear white to the wedding that way. This deliberate and dramatic upstaging of the original is what a sequel does. To do this while also being faithful in large part to the original is a hell of a needle to thread. The deftness with which Dimension of the Machine manages it might make it the best of Quake 1, a quarter century's worth of refinement in one remarkable package. The frame is that you're rune hunting again. 5 realms await, each with its own rune.
Hey, what the fuck?
Extensible a...
Muchas gracias por suscribirte, Leo Brill. Gracias por bancarme y por aumentar el tiempo más. Bueno, sigamos. Gracias.
The frame is that you're rune hunting again. 5 realms await, each with its own mood and theme and rune. Before talking about the best of them, I want to talk about the most clever and visually impressive. The Realm of the Cultists is actually one of the shorter units, starting as the most beautiful and ending as the most sinister. Almost immediately at the beginning, you approach a vast cathedral in the middle of a green canyon land. Blue skies, white marble, totally unlike anything from the original campaign or Quake 2 at all. And yet the doors have blood pentagrams and monsters infest its halls. This leads to a fun fight where, upon winning, the floor drops out and you fall into a deep pit. It's an almost From Software kind of touch. Yet the broader sequence feels so perfectly in keeping with the Quake vibe. It leverages those weird knights and toxic ghost thingies into something that actually feels artistically cohesive. The cathedral basement has some weird tech that culminates in a portal. This portal inverts the whole cathedral. You're turned backwards, upwards, on the ceiling, and when you reach the main chapel again, the whole place is now some kind of hell dimension. It's the coin flip inverse of the previous level in every way. It looks tremendous. There's such a visual drama to it, and the tightness of the player progression through the 2-level set makes it a joy to be in. The hellish version feels surreal enough to actually give off appropriately dire and sadistic vibes. It feels evil. It's evocative, emotional, and cryptic, just like all the best of Quake 1. Not all of them value the visuals of the world so highly as this realm, like, as a good counterexample, the Realm of the Machinists. It's a pretty relentless industrial maze where mean combat encounters and classic labyrinthine progression is king. It seems like the one that's meant to be played first. It hews the closest to the classic rhythms of the original Quake 1 campaign. It does its best to toss in some modern touches, though. The original Quake rarely ever bothered to create large combat arenas, and when it did so, it was mostly to do a 2-tiered kind of thing, where there were a lot of enemies above you instead of just hanging out in a murder pit with you. Which made sense because that kind of 3D was such a novelty at the time. Being able to aim above so cleanly was something worth showing off. The modern Dooms are all about the big brawl in breathable arenas. Dimension of the Machine leans into that a little, Hall of the Machine leans into it a lot. Dimension of the Machine modernizes this way mostly where it feels right for the rhythm, climactic moments like this final big combat challenge in the realm of the Machinists. The environment feels like the original Quake, even if all the spinning gears in the background mark it as being a bit more of a modern production. An arena fight feels right for the moment. All the traditionally designed encounters build up to it very well. Dimension of the Past wanted to do something in keeping with the original campaign. Dimension of the Machine, even in its more classic-feeling levels, wants to improve on it with modern technique. Consider then the realm of the Astrologers. It's more ambitious with the way it incorporates fantasy and sci-fi into a heady, chaotic blend than anything in the original campaign. It begins in some kind of astral plane with floating platforms made of rock. It's like Half-Life Zen, but a little more mystical. This leads to a big fantasy temple, mysterious and ancient. So far, so engaging. Then the level drops a twist. The temple is trapped and you get transported to a cell in a sci-fi prison. A sudden, complete tone shift like 5 minutes into the level. Fighting through the sci-fi base, you reach a slip gate, which takes you to another sci-fi facility, but in a fantasy world with collapsed castles, a dig site. The base itself is weirdly detailed and even naturalistic in some ways, with an actual barracks that's collapsing into a lava field, a cafeteria, and a motor pool. It is so much less abstract than any of the facility levels in the original campaign. It uses instead the kind of environmental naturalism that Half-Life pioneered. Then the level twists again, even more spectacularly. The deeper down the dig site you go, the more it pivots back to fantasy, then dark fantasy. There's a hellish, shattered temple down there in the depths that looks more actively demonic than anything the original Quake or the original Dooms managed to accomplish with their own engines in their own time. It's metal as fuck, yet it keeps going down to a series of platforms that hang suspended over a blank void. The bottom of the world. Which makes no physical sense, but that's the point of fantasy. It just has to feel right, and magic covers the rest. So within just 1 of 5 units in this new campaign, the developers demonstrate complete tonal mastery over the conflicting elements of sci-fi and fantasy that the original completely failed to resolve. Here they are in actual harmony, a sci-fi civilization using their slipgates to explore a magical universe filled with dark secrets man was not meant to know, hidden horrors never meant to be unearthed. The realm of the Astrologers, using only level design, creates a more coherent narrative than anything in the first game, and a more creative narrative than anything in the second game. The realm of the Astrologers isn't even the best, most impressive unit, which is astounding to me. While spending 40 to 60 minutes on 2 levels is a long time by Quake standards, the density of the levels and their truly remarkable scale means that you're actually experiencing cool new things at a much faster rate than some games ever manage at all. The realm of the Blacksmiths is one of the best levels of anything that I've ever played. Distinguishing between the 2 levels is pointless. They are completely interconnected and function as a whole. The art design for this realm is, I feel, the absolute peak of what Quake can be, a beautiful example of what could have been if the original team had, 25 extra years to figure out what the game was supposed to be about. There's just a ton of implicit lore in the level too. This dimension, or planet, or whatever this is, collapsed a long time ago. Now the scavengers have come. These ancient cathedrals and castles have been taken over and burst open by a parasitic industrial infrastructure. First level is just breaking open the castle factory thing. It's a complicated, involved process, but the scale of the castle is never compromised or forgotten. As deep into the tunnels and corridors as you get, the level always takes the time to orient you and show you that you haven't even gotten close to breaching the walls of the thing. When you go down into it, the whole depths of the castle are bathed in red. It's not just the brown industrial of Quake 2 and a lot of Quake 1, it is Gothic industrial. Trent Reznor would be proud. In a lesser map, this basement would be the whole of it. Instead, the level climbs out of the basement, back into the interior courtyards and towers of the castle, where the unit's rune is trapped inside some kind of sinister machine. All this massive sci-fi infrastructure that you've been snaking around for an hour all leads back here to the source of magic that it was designed to drain. As if all this Space Marine stuff was part of a vast military empire that spanned dimensions, singularly devoted to expansion and power, like the Strogg once were. And say, isn't that the symbol of the Strogg on the banner in the main unit selection room? Isn't that their symbol on all these computer screens and crates? The Strog symbol was featured.
What the fuck?
All this massive sci-fi infrastructure that you've been snaking around for an hour all leads back here to the source of magic that it was designed to drain. As if all this Space Marine stuff was part of a vast military empire that spanned dimensions, singularly devoted to expansion and power, like the Strog once were. And say, isn't that the symbol of the Strog on the banner in the main unit selection room? Isn't that their symbol on all these computer screens and crates? The Strog symbol was featured on crates even in the original 1996 campaign, but the reason for that was simply that no one had yet come up with the Strog, and its adoption that way was the result of a massive rebranding of all enemies and weapons in Quake 2. Dimension of the Machine takes a developmental oversight and makes it an actual narrative beat. It connects Quake 1 with Quake 2 in a fascinating way. And in a universe of infinite dimensions and possibilities, why not? Especially if fucking around with timelines and alternate dimensions was already such a strong component of the setting. Dimension of the Machine is such a fascinating object in terms of game design because it uses all of its modern tricks and techniques to enhance the nostalgia and backwards-looking elements. It does not feel like a truly modern shooter, it feels like a modern Quake. It feels like the kind of thing one might have expected to get out of the actual Quake 2 back in the 90s instead of the big rebrand to the Strog. To position itself as a middle transition between Quake 1 and Quake 2 allows both games to flow together in a way they never did before. Where Quake Champions just kind of shrugged, simplified the lore, and admitted it made no sense, Dimension of the Machine has grappled with its nonsense in a way that is as elegant as it is cryptic. I think it is such a shame that something so energizing to the franchise as a whole got labeled as little more than a bonus campaign, tucked away on the back shelves of a remaster where no one bothers to look. Call of the Machine is a better sequel to Quake 2 than Quake 4 was. I like Quake 4. I like it a lot. But Quake 4 didn't try to understand or improve on Quake 2 in as comprehensive a way as Call of the Machine did. Quake 4 was a soft reboot more than it was a true sequel. It was in line with current trends in its era of gaming and aimed that direction. It wanted to be cinematic and glossy, which it succeeded in, especially for a game from 2005.
Hola, Omega, ya tenés el cerebro frito. No, estaba terminando ya terminé esta cosa, porque es un chabón que hace buenos videos y me lo como todo. ¿Hace cuánto Omega está hipnotizado por video? Es el mismo video, es largo solamente. Así que no pasa nada.
Be cinematic and glossy trends in its era of gaming and aimed that direction. It wanted to be cinematic with current trends in its era of gaming and aimed that direction. It wanted to be cinematic and glossy, which it succeeded in, especially for a game from 2005. Call of the Machine, instead, does the same thing as Dimension of the Machine by creating a huge array.
¿Cuántos videos de este tipo te comiste hoy? Es el único. Dura 2 horas y media. Por eso, es largo. Hola, mira, podemos ver cómo te crecía el bigote a lo largo de Extensible. Es como esos timelapse. ¡Qué asco! Omega reacciones. Déjenme disfrutar de... O sea, no hago nada de lo que hago cuando estoy sin stream. Una sola cosa que me gusta hacer, que es sentarme y ver una review larga de algo. Es algo que disfruto. Se los comparto y Omega XQC. O sea, una cosa, qué asco, la decadencia de Twitch, XQC, Omega reacciones, la élite, qué asco. Déjenme terminar, hijos de puta.
And glossy, which it succeeded in, especially for a game from 2005. Call of the Machine, instead, does the same thing as Dimension of the Machine by creating a huge array of themed operations that all pull on some design thread of the original campaign, creating more impressive, more extreme versions of the old rhythms and environments. This time, it's 6 units with 3 or 4 levels apiece. Like Dimension of the Machine, this campaign is actually longer and much more involved than the original in the 90s. There were units of Quake 2 that a player could blitz through in like 15 old rhythms and environments. This time, it's 6 units with 3 or 4 levels apiece. Like Dimension of the Machine, this campaign is actually longer and much more involved than the original in the 90s. There were units of Quake 2 that a player could blitz through in like 15-20 minutes back in 1997, and that just isn't the case here at all. The levels are incredibly dense, many of them requiring the light inter-level backtracking that was such a prominent part of the original campaign. There is a great deal of respect for the traditional pacing and structure of classic Quake 2 levels. Without dialogue, the personality that was conveyed by the game in the first place was done through the twin pillars of level design and encounter design. These rhythms of combat, rhythms of navigation, were what made Quake 2 feel different from Quake 1, or Doom, or anything that came after. Quake 2 was such a unique, idiosyncratic game that upsetting its particular balance too much runs the risk of destroying that sense of personality. It's a delicate thing, which makes it all the more impressive that Call of the Machine completely disrupts the encounter design to modernize it much more than any of the visuals. It's closest, in terms of player experience, to the new Dooms, Doom Eternal particularly, with the way it uses massive clusters of enemies with particular standout threats that require specific player responses and prioritizations. Quake 2, originally, was not horde-oriented. There are actively hundreds more enemies per level here than there were in the original campaign. Not even Ground Zero touches the total number of kills that a player racks up across the course of Call of the Machine. This rhythm is entirely new. How then can the cumulative experience feel so in keeping with Quake 2? Because they can completely change the encounter design without even laying a finger on the player's arsenal. Quake 2's weapons were wildly inaccurate, and in the original campaign this was kind of a bid to get the player to behave more aggressively, to close the distance and engage face-to-face instead of plinking away from a distance. Plus, a lot of the original weapons take advantage of explosive splash damage in some way, or take the railgun, which has always had the property of being able to slam through multiple enemies along its trajectory. Originally, this
Hola, señor Peste.
extra damage would just be spillage. The initial release only asked the player to juggle like a maximum of 24 enemies in a given room, which is part of why it has a reputation of being a little easy compared to other id campaigns. For Call of the Machine, these giant hordes of enemies reach such absurd proportions that they don't actually change the threat level of the encounter. These enemies never live long enough to even hit you for the most part. Instead, all this leftover spillage damage catches enemies to the right and to the left of your crosshairs and takes down everything. Your abilities and your toolkit are faithfully preserved from the original Quake 2. There is nothing new, nothing non-traditional about the way you play as a player. If the new content had just added a lot of new enemies, the difficulty would have actually spiked, like it did in Ground Zero, when it had a serious increase in battle density. By adding an absolutely absurd amount of obviously too many enemies instead, that difficulty spike is actually lost in the chaos of it, absorbed by the fact that every bullet that does not strike an intentional target takes down an unintentional one instead. The enemy hordes actually die faster than a similar horde might in Doom Eternal, being less mobile and less intelligent enemies. As a result, even if this kind of encounter design is extremely contemporary for the most part, the entire feel of the game is actually still grounded in the chunky player feedback of 1997. This is what makes it such an intimate sequel. It takes not only a full understanding of what made the original game unique to pull off, it takes a treacherous imaginative leap to intuit that it could be bent this far without breaking. The result is something truly special. Call of the Machine also modernizes its approach to boss fights, which actually does create a significant difference with the original. It adds a big health bar at the top of the screen and gives the boss a unique name, which isn't a modern thing particularly, but back in the 90s it was never part of the id house style for shooters. By withholding that feedback, the original fights of Quake 2 felt a little more desperate. You just kept piling on the damage and hoped the thing would die, eventually. The boss fights were also very uncommon. In Call of the Machine, there are multiple boss fights per unit, sometimes once a level, and a couple of them like Darkest Depths. Like with the regular enemies, the new campaign cranks up its intensity by making these encounters much more dense and heavy. While I do like the old style of withholding feedback for the purpose of tension, the new style has more flair and personality. The names for the bosses are often very playful and give an impression of how they fit into the setting. They become another tool for the non-verbal storytelling the level design is trying to accomplish. It's also another acknowledgement that, especially compared to Quake 1, the player's weapons in Quake 2 are absurdly powerful compared to the enemies. Since the release version in 1997, Quake 2 has allowed players to store their power-ups like quad damage and invulnerability instead of having to burn them when you pick them up like in Quake 1. Saving them for the boss battles was always the most satisfying move for that. By creating more frequent boss fights, there's more incentive to use those power-ups instead of saving them, creating a further incentive to engage with secret hunting within the level to find more. It's a more pleasing inventory loop, especially better than the approach the expansions took, where they were often really miserly with the power-ups and with ammunition to try to even out the difficulty and keep things tough. Call of the Machine's generosity with power-ups doesn't mitigate the difficulty so much as it just smooths out the flow of the massively dense combat encounters. One fun thing the campaign does is blend arena boss fights with plain old horde ambush encounters, creating these absurdist massacres where you're just burning through ridiculous amounts of ammunition and creatures. It's never one note, though. There's a genuine diversity of approaches to the boss fights. This one, at the end of the Wasteland unit, ditches the horde to pit you against a very difficult...
¿No estás bien? Sí, estoy viendo. ¿Qué pasó? ¿Qué? ¿Me veo pijeado? ¿Me veo como...? ¿Estoy bien? Tal vez en un rato me hago un café. ¿Está bien? ¿Cool? Bien.
This one, at the end of the Wasteland unit, ditches the horde to pit you against a very difficult mix of about a dozen medium and heavy enemies. There's a tank commander with a health bar, but he isn't special in any way. This particular fight is just a very traditional, but very difficult grouping of Quake 2 enemies. It wouldn't have been out of place in the original campaign, during the Palace unit anyway, where the intensity is at a nice peak. Without using a banked power-up, it would be possible to win this fight, but exceptionally brutal. With the player's damage quadrupled, this tough grouping just melts away into a mess of metal and meat. A lot of the success of the modern Dooms is that they're not about challenge exactly, they're about player empowerment. They're about ripping and tearing and being absolutely brutal, more brutal even than the hordes of demons opposing you. This feeling can be created in a very similar, extremely satisfying way within the already existing game systems of Quake 2. It just takes a bit of a new approach to tease that out. Call of the Machine also does a better job than Quake 4 of exploring the broader lore of the franchise and tying it together. Quake 4 tidied things up. Call of the Machine keeps it cryptic and messy, just like Dimension of the Machine did. Cryptic and messy is the only way that any of it can fit together at all. Call of the Machine does one better than just being that way, though, by exploring parts of the setting that only ever existed in the margins before, like how the Quake 2 manual story starts in the ruins of Dallas. One of the units of Call of the Machine, Ruined Earth, explicitly pivots away from Strogos to go back to the collapsing brick tunnels of post-invasion Earth. I'll admit that I kind of wanted a ruined cityscape, so the fact that it is mostly a bunch of tunnels is kind of a letdown. What's cool about the unit, though, is that it's a slow burn payoff for the original campaign, finally illustrating something from the actual paper manual, and also it's a fantastic parallel to Dimension of the Machine. Here, a Strog ship drills directly down into the Earth, stripping out precious metals. Consider, though, what they said in Realm of the Astrologers about the enemy arriving on black ships, or Realm of the Blacksmiths and all that parasitic technology they had. It's a very clever integration of both Machine Games campaigns through reference and allusion. Plus, having Earth in the mix as well as Strogos makes it feel like an actual war of some sort. There's even a moon mission where you can see our good old blue marble at the window. Call of the Machine is constantly playful with the possibilities afforded by multiple dimensions and slipgates. It focuses on the interdimensional aspect much more than the original campaign did, where the original Quake 2 tries to mostly tuck the slip...
Hola Pomelo, Pomardo, ¿qué tal? Pensé que se había ido porque no se movía. ¿Qué? No. Estoy muy estático, es que... Estoy muy concentrado. O sea, puto. Bueno.
Slipgates under the rug where they won't cause too much havoc with a pivot from chaotic genre mashup to focused military sci-fi. Call of the Machine brings back a little of the chaos, a little of the magic that was missing from Quake. One of the units has you infiltrating a factory of some kind that's hollowing out a gigantic dead god or something called Megacorps 4. The exterior is a larger, more impressive industrial structure than anything even Quake 4 ever tried to do. Visually speaking, even though Quake 4's engine is obviously more advanced, Call of the Machine uses the Kex engine and its unshackled possibilities to create visuals that are consistently more impressive than what Quake 4 had to offer. The art is simply better. Oddly, it's one area where I think Dimension of the Machine is actually better. The surrealism of Quake 1 that Dimension of the Machine intensified to such remarkable effect just isn't quite part of the Quake 2 aesthetic. Quake 2's more industrial, representational vibe carries over into Call of the Machine. It's part of what makes it feel so faithful to the original Quake 2 campaign. When Call of the Machine tries to do a maximized version of classic Strogg installation.
Hola Nico, ¿qué onda? ¿Estoy bien? Dale, mega movete, yo termino.
When Call of the Machine
Voy
intensified to such remarkable effect just isn't quite part of the Quake 2 aesthetic. Quake 2's more industrial, representational vibe carries over into Call of the Machine. It's part of what makes it feel so faithful to the original Quake 2 campaign. When Call of the Machine tries to do a maximized version of classic Strogg installations, like here in the Firewall unit, it is amazing. It's better than anything the expansions were able to accomplish, and it even borrows some weapons, enemies, and textures from the expansions to make the new campaign feel like a truly comprehensive Quake 2 experience. The way these units have a player start with just a pistol and a shotgun each time give each unit
Hola, señor Sea.
The way these units have a player start with just a pistol and a shotgun each time give each unit a better pacing than the expansions, who use linear progression and so were much slower to allow a player access to the full arsenal, and then much quicker to become stale once a player did get everything. There is a self-contained arc of player empowerment within each unit of Call of the Machine, 6 times in a row. One notable episode makes the wild choice to give you a BFG to start with and barely anything else. There is so much experimentation going on, there's so much fun within the level design itself. It's brand new art made with a palette from 1997. Call of the Machine is so conscious of how the fact that Quake has never had much of a plot or much consistency is actually a kind of artistic freedom if you're willing to look at it that way. It can be reshaped and newly molded into so many strange configurations and still remain faithful to the original campaign. Dimension of the Machine might have looked more interesting overall, but Call of the Machine improves on its source material in a far more comprehensive way. The last parts of Call of the Machine are the ones meant to tie Quake 1 to Quake 2 in an even more explicit way than they had been before. It was the part that I was the most excited about, and it was the only part that I felt kind of let down by. The problem is that Call of the Machine has dual climaxes, one of which is much better than the other. The Darkest Depths unit is the most unusual, visually distinct out of all of the units. It uses an aesthetic that isn't found anywhere else in either Quake 1 or 2, mediating them. It's an echo of the dig site level in Realm of the Astrologers, like Ruined Earth is an echo of Realm of the Blacksmiths. Here, the Strogg have been excavating some sort of ancient temple. The design is classic labyrinth, extremely dense, winding deeper and deeper and deeper. It is so much better than the mine sequence in Ground Zero, I can't even express it. Where the expansions to Quake 2 tried to add complexity, it often felt like complication for complication's sake. The complexity in the Darkest Depth unit is intriguing, immersive. It feels like an element of actual exploration and not just puzzle-solving a maze. The Deep Temple is especially fantastic. It has completely departed from the science fiction Quake 2 was so invested in. Murals depict good old shoves and 2 shambler worshippers. This is a temple to the ancient, betentacled Witch Queen, which is quite a way to finish off a story influenced more by World War II movies than by cosmic horror. At the bottom of the temple, you awaken an ancient evil. A shambler appears, just for a moment, released back into the world, no longer bound by either spells or genre conventions. Once you advance into the temple's dramatic final chambers, you find yourself in the middle of a one-for-one recreation of the boss fight from the end of Quake 1 World 1. Modir, not Cthon, but otherwise identical. Mechanically and thematically, we have looped back to the very beginning. Once you've beaten him, you jump down the exit hole, but then there's a twist. Driven mad by what you've witnessed, you die, lost to the dark magics that Space Marines were never meant to know. This is the one Marine of the 6 that doesn't make it back with the data CD needed to unlock the boss. The boss unlocks anyway, though. The thing is, why? This looping action with the temple to shoves at the bottom of the world was all that was needed to tie Quake 1 to Quake 2, a cryptic reference, a mashup of worlds and gameplay. The whole frame of Call of the Machine, however, is that all these data disks are meant to determine the location of the creature that made the Strogg in the first place. It's a big promise, and I was sure I knew the answer. Armagon, right? Armagon is literally the prototype and precedent for the Strogg within the franchise as it already exists. I was certain. But no. The last mission is visually striking. It does feel like an otherworldly interdimensional temple, but it's empty. The boss fights are just double bosses of types you've fought many times already. The big reveal of the Strog Maker itself is 2 Shamblers. 2 Shamblers? Yes, indeed. What's meant by this? How does it work? Why wasn't Darkest Depths just the final unit unlocked by the other 5? Especially because its climax reveal is so much better paced and more intriguing. The Marines even share the same fate in both climaxes, just like the Marines from Doom 64 and the original Quake expansions, lost to the cosmic void forever following their victory. It says that killing the 2 Shamblers severs the Strog connection to their maker, so is the idea that these are the 2 Shamblers in that mural who are Shub's chosen or whatever? If so, why did we not also get to fight Shubs again? Or fuck it, how about the awkward time dragon from Dissolution of Eternity? It lacks drama the way they did it here at the end of Call of the Machine, which is so weird considering how both Dimension and Call of the Machine were so skilled in creating drama throughout all of their levels, except this one. Oh well. Almost getting everything I want from a surprise Quake sequel is a lot more than I ever expected to get in 2023 anyway. It's hardly enough to diminish the tremendous accomplishment the new campaign represents broadly. Even if the climax was a little more awkward than it might have been, Call of the Machine and Dimension of the Machine do a more impressive job of binding the games together than anything else in the Quake franchise. There is a clear series of steps now, narrative steps, from the moody chaos of Quake 1 to the polished brutality of Quake 2. It's fitting that, in a game series that started off playing with alternate timelines and alternate dimensions, that the best version of these games came out a quarter century after their release. It's taken that long to understand their influence and appreciate their unique peculiarities. The story of Quake is an especially strange and convoluted one, whether fiction or non-fiction. Like its best levels, it wraps right back in on itself. It is one of the most wildly self-contradictory game franchises of all time. What is Quake? A land? A god? A tentacle queen? Single-player, multiplayer, labyrinths, deathmatches? After 100 hours, with all of these Quakes, the only answer I can figure is yes. It is all of these contradictions at once, and this incoherence is what makes Quake special. No matter how much time passes, we as players can always go back to that pivotal moment in 1996 when Quake stepped across the threshold into a new dimension for id Games. There is a tremendous weight and drama in these moments of extreme transition, a thrill in reliving them so long after they made their impact. There are parts when the story of Quake is complicated, and parts where it is dead simple. The beginning of any given Quake is consistent, at least. They always begin in one place, with one thing, with a shotgun, ready to rock and roll. Thanks for watching.
Oti. Ahí está. Una crítica de 2 horas y media sobre la franquicia Quake. Increíble trabajo, hermoso. Solamente no puedo hacer algo que me gusta hacer, que es anotar cierto tipo de referencias para después buscarlas yo. Pero bueno, que ponga algo abajo tampoco lo va a hacer. Está bien, pero me pija. Muy lindo. Muy lindo video, me encantó, me fascinó. Ahora solo me queda jugar Quake otra vez. ¡Ah! Creo que tengo que ir al baño. La Railgun del Quake 2 es la mejor Railgun. Puede ser. ¿Para cuándo el video de Pyro de 8 horas hablando sobre su serie favorita? Me pego un tiro. Le faltó edición. Sí, ayer cuando hablé de él, creo que sí, ayer hablé de él, dije que él no edita. Él no edita nada. Y bueno. Pero vea, tenés que editar cada palabra que decís, así yo... pena. Ahí está. ¿Qué no se ve? Bueno, mejor, que es nada, no es nada. Pero bueno, Bobux, esperen que tengo que limpiar esto. Denme un segundo que les voy a poner una cosita mientras limpio. O sea, de acá, pero. Eh, ¿Qué es esto? Ah, mira. Atómica. Eso. Moonfish. Ah, mira. Trápete el limbo. Nunca vi el launch trailer.
Man was born to dream, to do great things. Flying machines, space travel, even robots. But unfortunately, there are those who wish to crush those dreams. And that's where men like you come in, Sergei. Men sworn to defend mankind and its destiny.
Cabrones carbonizados.
I swore that the world would never see its like again.
Do you realize what this could mean for us? An international scandal.
Listo, choto.
They're not going to find out. The malfunction has been dealt with.
Tiene dos DLCs, este güey. El primero es raro y el segundo ya parece que nada tiene sentido. Buenísimo.
Then why did all those peaceful robots start hacking everyone to bits?
The entire world will be just like this.
You're a soldier, Agent B3. Your job is to cover me.
This place is a damn madhouse.
Who are you?
Xena. Granny Xena.
South, the whole world might end.
Get the fuck off me!
Espera, ¿estaba cantando en español? What the fuck? What the fuck? Ahí está el clásico. ¿Se acuerdan cuando le tiró beef al Harry Costra? Y es como, era una lucha de una pelea de inválidos. ¿Quién hubiese imaginado que esa canción sería para presentar a una refrigeradora ninfómana? Ay Dios, la heladera Horny puso en duda si comprarme una heladera con monitor. ¿Por qué? Ay. Bueno, quería ponerles algo, pero no sé qué. Voy a estar acá un segundo, pero quería buscar un alguito. ¿Qué es esto? Ah, esta es la cosa que veo. Mejor una heladera con hoyo. ¡Una heladera! ¡Con un agujero! Bueno, lindo video. Me gustó mucho. Ahí está.
Tarde la pesadilla de Halo Wars 2 nos presentó fascinantes flots nuevos, y desde aquel entonces he estado pensando en este video. En la historia de la serie han sido limitadas.
Ya jugaste el remake. ¿Jugaste el remake de Wolfenstein? ¿Cuál es el remake de Wolfenstein?
Hola, ¿cómo están? El flood ha sido un tema continuamente atractivo, intrigante, a pesar de su imagen grotesca y aterradora. La especulación y el debate sobre su posible regreso siempre han sido populares. En muchos aspectos, el flood ha sido uno de los motores impulsores de la saga de Halo. Sin embargo, después del final de la trilogía en Halo 3, su presencia y relevancia en la historia de la serie han sido limitadas, con solo menciones esporádicas y apariciones marginales. Aunque el destino del flood permanece incierto, este tema ha sido un punto recurrente en las discusiones relacionadas con el universo de Halo. Este video, por su parte, viene más enfocado en lo que ya conocemos del flood. Es momento de volver a abrir el libro de la saga en sus primeros capítulos. ¿Qué es el flood? ¿Qué o quiénes lo conforman? ¿Cuáles tipos de flood hay y qué hacen? ¿Qué diferencia a un flood portador de una forma de combate? ¿Qué diferencia podría manifestarse entre un Sengili infectado y un soldado Spartan? Bueno, este es el video que responde esas cosas y más. Ya ha sido un tiempo desde que he querido subir un video demostrando las diferentes formas infecciosas que conocemos. La expansión Despertar de la pesadilla de Halo Wars 2 nos presentó fascinantes flood nuevos, y desde aquel entonces he estado pensando en este video. Así que qué mejor ocasión que el presente para explorar las diferentes clases y formaciones del flood que conocemos, incluyendo aquellos que solamente han sido mencionados en novelas, dándoles por primera vez una imagen en este video, los flood que conocimos en la ya mencionada expansión para la secuela de Halo Wars y aquellos que han aparecido en cada juego de Halo. Pero antes de empezar con esta recopilación, hay algunos puntos que me gustaría aclarar para que todos comencemos este video en la misma página. El primero de ellos es una malinterpretación que frecuentemente me encuentro, la idea de que hay especies o individuos inmunes al flood por una variedad de razones. El ejemplo más común de esto es que los hongos o los Kikyar son inmunes al parásito, y eso es falso. Existía la creencia de que tanto los hongos como los Kikyar eran inmunes al flood debido a un simple proceso de eliminación. Básicamente, se sostenía la idea de que el flood los consideraba demasiado débiles para sobrevivir a su metamorfosis, en gran parte debido a los bajos niveles de calcio en sus estructuras óseas. Si bien esto no es completamente falso, no cuenta toda la historia. Es cierto que estos seres carecen de los altos niveles de calcio presentes en otros organismos, lo que los hace frágiles y vulnerables. Sin embargo, el flood tiene la capacidad de infectarlos y transformarlos si así lo necesita, y en realidad lo ha hecho en el pasado. La raíz de este rumor radica en la ausencia de grunts o jackals infectados en los primeros juegos de la serie. Mientras veíamos a elites o humanos infectados, nunca se presentaban grunts o jackals en esta condición. La verdadera explicación, claro, va a un nivel de producción. Bungie no desarrolló modelos para ellos porque en un videojuego, cada cosa que desarrolla significa otra que descartas, y Bungie enfocó sus recursos en otras áreas. Aún así, el concepto de arte para Halo 2 sugiere que grunts infectados fueron planeados pero finalmente descartados. Hablaré más a detalle sobre esto adelante en el video. Para extinguir cualquier duda, en los juegos de Halo Wars hemos visto ambos grunt y jackal infectados, así que no es como que no exista un precedente. Otro mito que ha circulado sostiene que el sargento Johnson era inmune al flood debido a una enfermedad conocida como síndrome de Boren, la cual había causado daños irreparables en su sistema nervioso, haciéndolo inmune al proceso de infección flood. Esta noción puede resultar confusa, ya que en algún momento formó parte del canon, pero posteriormente fue desestimada. Este tema narrativo se introdujo en la novela Halo Primer Golpe, donde la doctora Halsey diagnosticó que la supervivencia de Johnson al Flood podría estar relacionada con su participación en el proyecto Orion original y las modificaciones que este proyecto había generado en su organismo a nivel celular. Sin embargo, Bungie nunca respaldó esta decisión narrativa y optó por revertirla. Bungie tenía la intención de que el Flood fuera una amenaza única e imposible de enfrentar. El Flood se concebía como una enfermedad cósmica sin cura, vacuna o solución posible. En la posterior novela gráfica de Halo se aclararon estos hechos y se nos proporcionó la explicación definitiva. Johnson no es inmune al Flood, eludió su contagio gracias a una combinación de experiencia y suerte. El síndrome de Boren en realidad fue una explicación científica fabricada por la ONI, la Oficina de Inteligencia Naval, para encubrir la participación de Johnson en el altamente clasificado Proyecto Orión. Este proyecto había producido alteraciones en el sistema nervioso de los sujetos debido a las mejoras físicas aplicadas. En resumen, Johnson no era inmune al Flood, simplemente logró evitar ser infectado. Aunque es posible que su sistema nervioso sea más resistente que el de un ser humano promedio, no lo hace invulnerable. No existe, o al menos no se ha documentado, una inmunización efectiva contra el Flood. Y es probable que nunca exista, como se explicará más adelante en este video. A palabras de Joseph Staten, uno de los guionistas y líderes
Hola N8866, ¿qué tal? Hola.
creativos desde la infancia de la saga de Halo, la idea de que algo o alguien es inmune al Flood no debe ser considerada. El Flood es ambos invencible e inevitable por diseño e intención, una fuerza de la naturaleza completamente alienígena a nuestra galaxia, fuera del reino de nuestro entendimiento. Ahora que todos tenemos la misma idea y estamos conscientes de que el Flood puede consumirlo a todo y a todos, comencemos. Estas son todas las clases de Flood de las que hemos oído hablar en Halo.
Buenas noches. Asco, ¿por qué?
Comencemos con el aspecto más fundamental, las formas de infección del Flood. Estos pequeños y escurridizos agentes infecciosos no deben subestimarse, ya que constituyen la herramienta principal y más común que el parásito
¿Cuánto le queda el video? Recién empieza.
utiliza para reproducirse y aumentar su número, especialmente en las
Igual solo lo puse de fondo para ordenar cositas. Así que eso.
primeras etapas de su propagación. El Flood sigue un proceso cíclico para mantener su rápido avance y supervivencia, y este proceso comienza con la reproducción de formas infecciosas que pueden reclutar a más seres vivos para su causa. Se le da lugar a la producción
y me voy. Ahora vuelvo. Voy a hacerme el café, ahora regreso. Pero tardarme mucho poquito. Ahora vuelvo, ahora vuelvo. When vives en Argentina. Dejo esto y listo. Ahora regreso.
A4 Games, nos has traído uno de los videojuegos más queridos de la antigua generación. Metro 2033 es uno de mis mayores exponentes a la hora de hablar de mecánicas inteligentes, ya que los desarrolladores entendieron cómo crear un buen FPS y alejarse del genérico modelo Call of Duty. Claro que Metro 2033 nace directamente de una idea creada hace años. Sus mecánicas son un refinamiento de lo que creó la saga Stalker. En ese videojuego era importante saber cuándo atacar, curarse y entender que no somos un soldado invencible que pueda acabar con todo aquel que se le ponga enfrente. Tenemos que tener el equipo apropiado, los suministros suficientes y cuando haya que huir o esconderse, hacerlo, ya que el sistema de daño es exigente y si recibimos un tiro podemos morir desangrados. A4 Games fue creado a partir del equipo desarrollador de Stalker y lo demuestran en su estética y la atmósfera que tiene el videojuego. Es algo que siempre vas a adorar porque logra sentirte en la piel del protagonista y más con sus mecánicas jugables.
Вы все равно скоро сдохнете.
En 2007 se lanzó Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, el lanzamiento más original de la saga y traía no solo mecánicas nuevas, sino también perfeccionadas. COD exige un constante movimiento por parte del jugador sumado a unos reflejos increíbles. El diseño de niveles está creado específicamente para que no puedas parar un segundo ni planear ninguna estrategia, ya que los enemigos saldrán del mismo lugar siempre y morirán de la misma forma. Esto lo convierte en un videojuego de acción arcade donde lo importante es matar de la forma más rápida posible y mecánicas como el devolver granadas lo hacen aún más frenético. Claro que exige más del jugador y no solo que sea algo monótono como el antiguo modelo Quake. Call of Duty cambió el modo de juego, instaló las bases del shooter militar moderno y se convirtió en el rey del multijugador gracias a sus mecánicas rápidas y fáciles. Es algo genial porque destronaron al modelo Quake, pero el problema está en que, como Call of Duty vendía millones de copias, otros videojuegos empezaron a copiar el modelo, sus mecánicas se volvieron un estándar y la innovación murió. Hasta videojuegos que adoro como Crisis 2 tienen el estigma COD marcado encima. Claro que tiene su propia personalidad, pero la sombra de Activision no desaparece. Pero esto no le importó a A4 Games, ya que crearon su videojuego no fijándose en lo que es popular, sino fusionando el ambiente con sus mecánicas para que todo tenga sentido. Es satisfactorio ver cómo Metro 2033 funciona tan bien a nivel jugable. Las armas no son clones futuristas de las armas actuales, como pasa en Destiny. Pero también las mecánicas están diseñadas para que nos sintamos una mierda indefensa y es genial. Si no examinamos bien el nivel, puede aparecer un enemigo por cualquier lugar y vamos a morir. Como los recursos son escasos, es muy necesario examinar el cuerpo muerto de nuestros enemigos para poder sacar todo lo que podamos. El cubrirse es primordial porque nuestra vida es un chiste y sí, tenemos botiquines, pero es muy posible que se te acaben y termines muriendo. Algo tan simple como usar una linterna lo convirtieron en una mecánica jugable. Tienes un generador que te dejará recargar la luz de tu linterna para poder alumbrar de forma más eficiente, pero esto puede llamar la atención de los mutantes. Entonces puedes ir a ciegas y tal vez morir pisando una trampa o alumbrar tu camino y prepararte para un enfrentamiento del cual quizás no salgas vivo. Explorar el exterior es peligroso ya que necesitamos una máscara de oxígeno que se puede romper si nos atacan. Además necesitamos filtros para poder respirar, pero ese recurso escasea. Entonces podemos explorar el mapeado en busca de ese objeto, pero podemos ser atacados y también corres el riesgo de que el límite de oxígeno llegue a cero y mueras. Las mecánicas tienen coherencia con el ambiente, van de la mano para crear una experiencia más inmersiva y es una clase maestra de cómo usar las mecánicas de forma inteligente. Alguna vez le haré un análisis a este videojuego porque es una de esas joyas que deben ser recordadas por lo genial de su diseño. Actualmente estamos en la generación del futuro. Títulos como Titanfall, Destiny o el nuevo Call of Duty apuestan por los jetpacks, la velocidad y armas que no se diferencian las unas de las otras, y Metro 2033 en su tiempo logró marcar la diferencia y enseñar cómo se deben usar las mecánicas de un shooter militar moderno a favor de una experiencia más inmersiva. Si no has jugado este videojuego te recomiendo que lo hagas. No tiene la mejor historia del mundo, o por lo menos no está bien desarrollada, pero aún así es interesante y por supuesto su apartado jugable es muy potente. Es una experiencia que no te debes perder si eres un fanático de los videojuegos de disparo en primera persona y si eres un gamer en general. Sí, es exigente y si vienes de jugar entrega tras entrega de Call of Duty vas a morir de forma vergonzosa una y otra vez. Pero una vez que entres al metro, junto a tu máscara de oxígeno y tu arma artesanal, estoy seguro que es una experiencia que no podrás olvidar.
She's in pain.
Los creadores de Just Cause hicieron un trabajo genial con esta franquicia y es una lástima que haya salido al mismo tiempo que Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, porque fue ignorado y criticado por no ser tan bueno como la obra de Kojima, y yo no lo creo así. En construcción de un mundo abierto y atmósfera, Mad Max aplasta Metal Gear Solid 5 y seguro eres un fan de ese videojuego porque todo el mundo le puso un 10, obra maestra, GOTY 2015, etc. Pero yo no creo que sea perfecto porque si haces un videojuego de mundo abierto y no aprovechas ese género, no estás haciendo las cosas bien. Pero no me voy a poner a criticar Metal Gear Solid 5, estamos aquí para hablar de Mad Max. Las películas nos narran de un mundo post-apocalíptico donde las antiguas leyes humanas no tienen validez y es un sobrevive como puedas. Esto es explotado en el videojuego a niveles geniales gracias a que es un mundo abierto. Pero más allá de las opciones jugables e historia, tengo que sentirme en el lugar para que mi accionar tenga sentido y profundidad. Aquí entra la brillante atmósfera de Mad Max. Un lugar desolado pero peligroso donde una tormenta de arena puede llegar de la nada y joderte la vida. Un ambiente desértico que gracias a la brisa y la iluminación del calcinante sol te permite ver estampas hermosas de un paisaje post-apocalíptico que rivaliza con grandes como Fallout y Stalker. Sientes que estás en ese lugar, tu caminar lo demuestra, intentar llegar a lugares imposibles, recorrer grandes desiertos, ver cómo la humanidad se adaptó al ambiente y encontrarte con pequeños asentamientos tan peligrosos como numerosos, es un lugar que merece ser explorado. Cuando entras a un barco oxidado y exploras la construcción, ¡Dios! ¡Es precioso! Gracias al estilo visual de la franquicia y diseño de arte que es un placer observar. Escuchar los vehículos a la lejanía, ver lugares donde puedes ir gracias a la brutal distancia de dibujado, entrar en una persecución por tu vida, son detalles que hacen al mundo de Mad Max más vivo y realmente aprecio este esfuerzo. Que el mundo esté desolado está justificado por el ambiente y el contexto que se cuenta la historia. Y si bien puedes no encontrar una actividad que hacer, es muy posible que encuentres ruinas que te cuenten detalles interesantes sobre este universo. Y explorar es realmente genial porque su atmósfera invita a la aventura. ¡Oh, Mad Max! puede no ser el videojuego del año y seguro se queda en un costado junto a otras obras infravaloradas, pero tiene una ambientación y atmósfera tan bien logradas que merece que te des una vuelta por su mundo posapocalíptico. Stalker es una de las sagas que más adoro. La sombra de Chernobyl me enamoró completamente. Su atmósfera, el sistema de disparos, el complejo sistema de inteligencia artificial, la historia, los diálogos, el bar Los 100 Rands, el cauterizador cerebral, los temibles laboratorios subterráneos que daban más miedo que cualquier videojuego de supuesto terror psicológico moderno. En fin, es una experiencia fantástica. Clear Sky vino lleno de bugs, funcionaba mal y sigue funcionando mal, aunque ahora por lo menos puedes terminarlo y mejoró bastante con mods como el Complete Edition. Y por supuesto Call of Pripyat, el perfeccionamiento de la saga, con un buen rendimiento, uno de los primeros videojuegos en usar bien el DirectX 11, nuevos entornos, una historia genial, un sistema de RPG más complejo, emisiones gigantescas, en fin, uno de los videojuegos más difíciles que puedes jugar y la última gran experiencia en este universo. Los responsables de estas hermosas obras fueron GSC Game World. Tardaron años en
Ya está. Hola, ¿qué tal? A ver, ¿a quién iba a pijear? A ver, ¿dónde está? Uy, espera. Ah. Bueno, ahí está. ¿Quién iba a pijear? Del chat. ¿Dónde está? No entiendo, Mío dijo, no entiendo esta correlación de comentarios. Agarró. Mío dijo, ¿alguien me resume el stream de hoy? Después, Xavier le toxiqueó, dijo, directo de hoy igual robar contenido ñ. Vi un video, pero bueno. Y después Mío le dijo, entonces nos falta mucho, sin contexto, dijo pues. Muchas gracias, Madreman, por suscribirte.
Hija, no termina más.
Qué asco. Muchas gracias. Madreman, estaba leyendo lo que estaba diciendo. Entonces, Xavier le dijo eso. Mío dijo, entonces no falta. No, entonces no falta mucho. Xavier le puso, porque what the fuck. Después, Mío puso, tal vez estoy juzgando de más y aún tiene más actividades por enseñar. No sé a qué se refiere. Es todo tan falta, como que hay una. Fue hasta arriba, hay una parte que falta. De que haya. Gameplay robado, bardeando. Nada, bueno, tanta ahí todo choto. Está tirando tox. No entiendo. O sea, el tox por lo menos tiene que ser consentido, no simplemente boludez por boludez. Por eso quería saber por qué estabas diciendo eso. Me hice el café y leí eso y por qué. ¿Qué hacer? Me da cáncer. Hola.
Omega, quita ese gorro de ahí.
¿Dónde, amor? Ah, sí. Soy un boludo, sí, tenés razón. Bueno. Eh, necesito dopamina, hace algo. Deja de robar, me tienes hasta los huevos te vas baneado 10 minutos. A ver,
Dale Omega, duerme a esos petes generación TikTok.
qué asco. Eh, Llegarás en tirar tox. Omega, está bien, gracias, mío. Gracias por disculparte. Gracias. Y Raybax, te vas detonado porque no he robado nada y me tienes hasta los huevos, así que hijo de puta. Es más, le pongo mis videos. Uy, Sida. Bueno, ahora la cosa es esta. Reglas. No pasó nada acá. Tengo el café que tomar. Eh,
Gracias por hacerme café.
eh, ahí vuelvo, chat. Un segundo.
Ahora los bits controlan el stream. Qué payaso que te vestiste hoy, Silla.